Hey everybody, some quick business up top since this ep was recorded earlier. As you may have seen, I've been trying to get the word out that our show tomorrow, October 14th, at the Town Hall Theater in New York City starts at 8 p.m. sharp. Doors at 7, show at 8. The Town Hall's website had erroneously posted a 7 p.m. start. That is incorrect. The show is at 8 p.m. And if you're in NYC, there are still a few tickets left for this. The show is going to be our biggest show ever by audience size. There's going to be music, special guests. I plug this shit enough. Ticks are at chapotraphouse.com/live. Make it if you can. It will be one for the books. See you tomorrow if you're in NYC. In the meantime, enjoy this entry in the Inebriated past.
Hello, folks. Matt Christman here, introducing you to the first episode of what we're hoping to turn into a series about the United States and its neighbor to the south, Mexico. Mexican-American relations are one of the key components of contemporary politics, as we all know, and have been incredibly important in shaping both countries throughout their histories. And to start with, I wanted to begin with the primal scene of American-Mexican relationships, which is, of course, the Mexican-American War. And to help me with that, we have here scholar, author, handsome man about town, Matt Karp, to talk it through. How you doing?
I have to buzz you on that already. You've said Mexican-American War twice, Matt. That's not the preferred nomenclature. We are all Americans in this hemisphere. It is the U.S. Mexico War, which appropriately puts the onus for the invasion on the United States, which is accurate. Yes. And we should dispense with all the Americanisms from now on.
Well, you know what? The way I think of it, Amerigo Vespucci was a fraud and a pimp, so I think it makes sense that Americans should be us, should be the nation of con artists and their dupes that currently dominates the globe. We're the Americans.
It's true. The state, you know, Estados Unidos doesn't quite land in the same way. Well, I properly it should be, I guess, the Yankee War or something like that.
Yeah, now we're talking.
But are you guys calling this series? This is cliche, but it's such a great line. So far from God, the
yeah,
Porfirio Diaz.
Yes, that's it exactly. So far from God, so close to the United States. I always assumed he didn't say that because he always seemed like kind of a dumbass. But you know,
also his whole
squirrel finds a nut.
I know like four things about that guy, but one of them is that he oriented his, the sort of Mexican economy in conjunction with with American capital like no other Mexican leader. He achieved that relationship as much as anyone. I mean, up until the 19th century, not that we need to get into this, but Mexico had its trading relationships with Europe were at least as important for a long time as with the United States. I think that's like almost like a Porfiriato achievement in the late 19th century to put the U.S. as a kind of, economic overlord of Mexico. So I guess he knew what he was talking about, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, he was essentially recognizing the grim and unalterable reality that the U.S. wasn't going to really be accepting other suitors for Mexican industry. But one of the reasons that they find themselves in that position in the late 19th century is because they had half their territory straitjacked by the United States in the 1840s, which had the effect of massively increasing the United States' size, but also pretty much guaranteeing a civil war and fatally undermining the stability of the second party system that until that point had been doing okay at managing the burgeoning sectional crisis.
That's certainly the sort of satisfyingly kind of tragic, ironic arc that we like to tell ourselves. I have a little bit of reservations about some parts of that narrative because it feels like it's like we so badly want these assholes to get their comeuppance, and they did. But was it? Maybe we can get into that later. You and I can bat that around about whether what the actual impact was on the sectional crisis. But I assume that'll become we should fighting part first, maybe.
I guess, but that is an intriguing question. So you're suggesting that if, say, Henry Clay hadn't been such a persnickety baby and he'd accepted that vice presidential nomination when it was offered to him, and he became president instead of if it had been for James Burney and his Burney Bros in New York,
right? If Clay had won,
right? If Clay had won, and we had not had a Mexican War, that would not have really done anything to delay the arrival of the Civil War. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think it's questionable. I think this gets us into the weeds of the 1850s, and where we are quite happy to live. But the breakup of the second party system happened. Yes, it was a concatenation of lots of things, absolutely accelerated by the tumult over the Wilmot Proviso and the question of slavery in California and the Mexican Cession and so on. But that was largely arranged and settled by the armistice of 1850. And what the things that the event, obviously, that this is just recounting the timeline, but the event that jump started and really electrocuted the party system was Kansas, Nebraska, and that was coming regardless of what happened in the far west. And I guess I'm struck by, in a lot of these, it's really hard to run this counterfactual tape. I actually wrote a whole first year grad paper on that precise question about Clay getting elected. There's a great piece if you really want to go nerdy what if history counterfactual, there's a very rare scholarly article by this guy Gary Kornblith, the historian at Oberlin, that was actually published by the Journal of American History, that follows that narrative all the way to the end. Clay is elected in 44 there, and all the other assumptions prevail. There's no annexation, there's no war, there's no seizure of the southwest third of North America. And he follows that tale to sort of effectively, in his mind, make the argument that this was essential. But that's sat uneasily with me for a really long time. I do think that a million things would have been different, but you still were going to face the question of slavery's expansion to the Great Plains. And I'm struck in those negotiations in the 50s how little people really are. I don't want to say they don't care about New Mexico, but New Mexico and the status of slavery in those Mexican lands after California is kind of, everyone's willing to fudge that a little bit. They do not want slavery in the Louisiana Purchase on the Great Plains. And so, I don't know. There's a lot more to it than this, but on that narrow sense, I also have an issue with this, just that sort of almost implotment of, okay, there's this Emerson quote that is trotted out in it's in Battle Cry of Freedom. It's in every history of the American Civil War, really, or every history of the U.S. Mexico War. Mexico will be to us, as arsenic is to the hungry man. We will consume it, but Mexico will poison us. And that there is that, it's very satisfying to be like, he was right. Even Calhoun called it forbidden fruit. There's a lot of consumption metaphors in 19th century American history. It's a hungry nation, but and sometimes it eats more than it can handle. I don't want to completely reject it, but I think if you look at what the U.S. Mexico War, actually achieved, I try to make this case in the book that it really achieved the cold fact of American hegemony over the entire North American landmass. That was never altered. And it didn't resolve the sectional crisis or the question of slavery, but I'm not so sure that the ironic flavor doesn't triumph doesn't overcome its sort of achievements in general for grandiose U.S. power, and that might have happened irrespective of the Civil War's outbreak.
Okay, so let's start off then with the situation on the eve of the Mexican, the outbreak of hostilities, and specifically the annexation of Texas, which in many ways makes the Mexican-American War inevitable. Yes. And which, as such, was something that was significantly controversial and saw a large amount of specifically Whig resistance, but which was made possible by the election of one man, our only mulleted president, James K. Polk of Tennessee. So what's the deal with Young Hickory, and what political coalition does he represent?
Our only mulleted president so far, Matt.
Yeah, that's true.
Have to clarify. Gen Z is bringing it back, so I'm expecting a mullet in 2050.
Before or after the weird perm thing that they have now?
I don't know. First president with a fade. I'm also looking forward to that. I guess Obama didn't have one, right? He didn't get interesting.
Never got nutty with it. He never got interesting with it, which is very much par for the course.
Yeah. So, and Clinton. Okay, well, we'll leave that. I don't have a lot of takes on Clinton's hair. Yeah, it was Polk. I mean, but really, it was Tyler. I mean, this is the sort of the slippage between the sort of his accidency. His accidental ejaculation, John Tyler, and who really masterminded his White House really masterminded the diplomacy that led to the annexation of Texas in 1843 and 44. Even though they couldn't get the job through Congress, he really laid the groundwork for it. And really, I mean, it was one of these genuine. Doing my dissertation convinced me of this. It's a genuine moment where a conspiratorial cabal, not the only one, but one where you can actually sort of be sure through the documents that a conspiratorial cabal of sort of like-minded ideologues took over U.S. foreign policy and commandeered it toward a very consequential object. Now, of course, there was broad support for the annexation of Texas in the country. It wouldn't have been possible if it would have been more difficult if most of the country loathed the idea. But the political class of the Jacksonian era was not keen on annexing Texas. Even Andrew Jackson himself was leery about these kinds of consequences for destabilization that you're talking about the party system, about a war with Mexico. And it's not like Jackson really was afraid of fighting or, had anything but delight at the thought of a war with Mexico in some senses. But he was cautious as president, and even into the 1840s, he was a little bit skeptical. What hypercharged this was this cabal under Tyler, his first Secretary of State, Abel Upshur, his second Secretary of State, none other than John C. Calhoun himself, and the kind of knot of pro-slavery intellectuals around them who were feeding them advice, who were this guy Duff Green, who's going all around the capitals of Europe and into Texas and Mexico. The fear that Great Britain was going to intervene to somehow destabilize slavery in Texas really hypercharges this effort to get Texas into the Union at all costs, regardless of domestic political repercussions. And I think they win over a kind of dominant majority of Southern Democrats for that, including Jackson and consequentially including Polk. And that helps get Polk the nomination. That's why he's nominated in the first place, is to be the Texas guy. The Democrats in 44 in Baltimore fend off the Southerners, basically install this 2/3 rule so that Van Buren, who's overwhelmingly the sort of the, wouldn't say the DNC, but it wasn't the DNC, but he was overwhelmingly the kind of political hack favorite to win the nomination, is stalled. Certainly the northern favorite is stalled, can't get over the 2/3 line. Would have been interesting if Bernie had tried to pull a 2/3 rule. I mean, it wouldn't have helped, but anyway, the South blocks Van Buren's nomination, and it falls to the dark horse, Polk, who in office then rapidly proceeds with the annexation project that Tyler has laid out. So Polk, Texas is in the Union effectively within a few weeks of Polk's administration in early 1845. And by that point, U.S. Mexico relations are really breaking down.
I always feel for Van Buren there. He spent his entire career kissing those fucking people's asses.
He did.
Like, the key to power is just not pissing off Southerners, and it just still wasn't good enough to get the damn nomination passed.
He forged this coalition that became the dominant force in antebellum politics. 20 years ago,
letters to the Richmond Junto and shit, and it just means nothing.
Yeah, it got him nowhere. It's true.
What are you doing? What have you done for us lately, Martin Van Ruin? Get out of here.
Yeah, and his loyalists. I mean, that's obviously the barn burner story 4 years later, but some of the hardcore Van Burenites were so pissed off. I think Silas Wright, who's one of the New Yorkers around him, was offered the vice presidency, turned it down flat out, which I think is actually a pretty rare event in American history, that a direct offer of even Veep is tendered and just rejected without mercy, just out of loyalty to Matty Van. Those guys had spirit anyway. The Albany Regency, yeah.
So Polk in office assures annexation of Texas, and then very shortly after, a intentional campaign of military provocation on the border at the notorious Nueces Strip.
Yeah, classic. Yeah, beautiful country out there.
Yeah.
I don't think it is. I genuinely don't think it is. I cannot read. I reviewed a book on the Civil War in the Rio Grande, and the number of kind of, written by historians in the Rio Grande Valley, I'm sure there's a poetry to the place like there is any other, but just this description of sort of flat, bug infested, it's both dry and swampy at the same time. No relief to the terrain. It just does feel like one of the most difficult. I mean, and if you look at some of those counties, even today in Texas, like which we've been looking at with the what's his name, the run against that Blue Dog Democrat down there. I've been looking at those counties. There's some of those counties still in that Nueces Strip where there's like 75 people live in it. It's just uninhabitable outside of the settlements. Anyway, he sends Zachary Taylor and his army of occupation to just go right up to the maximal border claim that Texas, the independent Republic of Texas, had asserted. Mexico had never recognized Texas's independence, full stop. But that was kind of a bit of a paper thing. In reality, Texas had been around for 10 years. It was fragile, but it had been established. And could Mexico have swallowed some form of the annexation of Texas? That's another interesting counterfactual, because so many different factions in Mexican politics, it was always possible for somebody to oust another faction by saying you're being too soft on the Americans. But it's possible. But the way Polk did it, it was impossible, because they jammed the army right up to the hilt of Texas's very dubious border claim. And then they sent this belligerent diplomat, John Slidell, Louisiana senator, who was totally in it. They named him a minister when he should have just been a commissioner. They did all of the little diplomacy wrong in this way that ignorance shades into, neglect, shades into disregard, shades into outright contempt. And they knew what they were doing. They were hoping, Polk wrote stuff in his diary like, perhaps a declaration of war may not be necessary. It's very clear what they were expecting. Mexico couldn't tolerate this. I mean, actually, the president at the time, Herrera, who was, I think, one of the sort of the Federalists, the liberals of the kind of Mexican party in the early 19th century, is divided between centralists who are conservatives and sort of liberals who are federalists, who are more kind of Enlightenment types. The centralists were more, this is very crude, were more kind of, God and not God and King, but church and strong central government rulers. Anyway, so this liberal Herrera wants to make a deal, or at least could imagine making a deal with him, but not the way that Polk conducted these negotiations, not the way he jammed Taylor right up to the hilt of the border. He sent the largest peacetime squadron in U.S. Navy history to date to the Gulf of Mexico. Everything is screaming war. He did a Putin, basically. Honestly, everything is screaming war, war, war. And there really wasn't much Herrera could do. And he ends up getting cooed by a centralist general who marches down to Mexico City and says, all right, Americans, back off. You're an illegal occupation of Mexican land. It's on. And at that point, not only is war inevitable, it's just a question of, timing, like what hour of the day that there'll be this first skirmish in this disputed territory.
And this leads to a number of skirmishes. And in May of 1846, there's a battle in Palo Alto and Reseda de la Palma, which sees the U.S. Rout Mexican forces and lets America know, like, this is something that can be won and must be won. And then on the 11th of May, 1846, the United States officially declares war. But there is Whig dissent, specifically, and more specifically, a young first-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln decides to do an epic own by demanding to know the spot where American blood was supposedly spilled that would justify this war, and is almost immediately turfed out of office.
Yeah. He doesn't. He was. That was his Lincoln's first nickname derived from this. His antics in Congress during the war, right? He was known as Spotty Lincoln because he kept demanding the spot resolution. It's a good one. It didn't really stick, but that was Lincoln in the 40s. Old Spotty.
Old Spotty.
Yeah.
Yeah. No wonder he lost re-election. You can't win with that. He had to go back to the drawing board, get rail splitter, something.
Yeah. Some of the some of the Whigs really got at it. Some of them got feisty. Even some of these conservatives who aren't, who didn't become anti-slavery heroes like Lincoln. I mean, there's this Ohio guy. I just looked this up, Thomas Corwin, who was a relatively conservative Whig, not a big deal, but they got really fired up and outraged at Polk, and he said something like, "The Mexicans will welcome American soldiers they will greet you with bloody hands and welcome you to hospitable graves." I mean, it was really like it was in that florid 19th century way that's so wonderful. But the truth is, in the early moments of the war, especially after these first winning battles, I mean, this is where Polk had the Democratic Party behind him, and he had a big chunk of the politically neutral or just the kind of classic American looky-loos. I mean, in some ways, this is the U.S.'s first foreign war. That's obviously not true. The United States had been extending its power and dominion over all sorts of other peoples from the moment of its inception, including overseas conflicts like in the Barbary Wars and so on. But this is the first. This clearly represents a different kind of a war on a different kind of scale. And the American reaction at home domestically, I mean, it really does fit into all of the, the kind of ugly Chapo stereotypes about, they had a Palo Alto. I know you'll like this, Matt, because it feeds into one of the deepest American, the deepest American religion. Actually, it's not Mormonism, although the Mormons were involved. They had a Palo Alto right after the battle. They made a Palo Alto root beer. So they were silly. So they had soda was present in this war.
The true American god, soda. The great god, soda.
They had to convert it back into corn syrup. Yeah. Although I guess probably root beer was different than, I don't know. But there was a kind of, this was an early, it coincided with the penny press, right? Famously. So you had, and the telegraph. So you had the first war correspondence. You had the first, breathless newspaper coverage of the war. You had it all happening, reading the news from Mexico. This kind of, actually, it's interesting. There's a lot of Vietnam era scholarship on Mexico that is like interested in playing with those comparisons between the U.S. and Vietnam. And in a lot of ways, there's something about the war with Mexico that feels more 20th century than a lot of these other conflicts. It's both in the kind of skullduggery and the conspiracy that started the sort of the dark cabals inside Washington, and then in the sort of just brazenly imperial conduct of the war, where which involve this really massive undertaking, sending, by the time, you have Taylor in Mexico, and maybe you want to get further into this, but by the time Winfield Scott is doing an amphibious landing in Veracruz, they're bombarding with a huge flotilla. They're bombarding the city of Veracruz. Then he marches all the way up, following Cortez's footsteps into Mexico City. Meanwhile, you have the U.S. Navy active in the Pacific, seizing California, marching through to New Mexico. It's an absolutely massive thing that, even though it's dwarfed by the scale of the Civil War, the kind of overseas projection of power is it's really striking and coinciding with a lot of these media phenomenon where people are following the war at home. There are, unlike Vietnam, the protesters, or at least maybe like the beginning of Vietnam, but the U.S. never really had a Palo Alto in Vietnam. You had massive bonfires and parades and, brass bands celebrating, Cerro Gordo, the heroes of Resaca de Palma, and it was just a sort of this mass phenomenon that, especially in that first year of the war, really drove forward, muted this Whig opposition, which was forceful at times, got the money for the war and ensured its ultimate successful prosecution.
Even in the face of the fact that the army that was supposed to carry out this invasion was undermanned, underfunded antebellum military in the time when democratic orthodoxy was not going to accede to the building of a significant standing army, and early struggles to try to get it into the field.
Yeah, they had a horrible time with supplies. I mean, it was. I think the Mexican army I read is about 25,000 when the war started, and the U.S. Army is 13,000. So the standing army doesn't really exist for all intents and purposes, and they have to create it. It is though. I mean, I will say, just skimming this stuff again, it does have echoes of all this America at war, both incredible. FUBAR, supply chain issues, and yet underneath it, this kind of incredible productive capacity, which was already visible in the 1840s in the sense that they can shoot out 100 firearms out of the early northeastern manufacturing centers, where gun manufacture is one of the first really heavy industries in the U.S. There are some things that they struggle to get out, but the mills of Massachusetts are firing out shoes, like 12,000 shoes a month for these soldiers for Winfield Scott's army. So even though they're getting there by like wagon over this shitty swampland, or stagnant on sailing vessels in the Gulf or whatever, it's incredibly fucked up, but there's this tension between incompetence, laughable incompetence in many cases, and this sort of, I wouldn't say awe-inspiring, maybe more like fear-inspiring, but it's just this kind of abundant power of the hints of which are being just beginning to be seen. I mean, obviously this is way before real industrialization, but you have in key articles of war, shoes and guns are up there, and the Northeast was already doing that.
Yeah, and we see, yes, the emergence of a pattern that's going to be deepened over time, where America has this nascent capacity, or this often untapped capacity that really only ever gets brought into full being by the war, and essentially by the extra constitutional space that's sort of created by war fighting, by the need to overlook niceties and the chains of the chains of legality that bind the state otherwise, to our constitutional order. And at every point, it's a war that just bursts forth, reveals new capacities, and then in the aftermath, has these new things that are now permanent fixtures of the American economy and political world.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's like we had this recent rerun of it, where you had a pretty spectacular galvanizing event, but it didn't produce what a war would have produced, with COVID anyway.
That's the thing. If there's nobody to give a gun to, it's no use.
Yeah, not the same kind of mobilization. I mean, this is going far afield, but it's a question whether our sort of little imperial wars have that impact anymore either, because it's also kind of off stage and managed in a different way. And Mexico is interesting in that way, to try to bring it back to that, I guess. It's both a kind of small standing army that didn't have, it wasn't like they instituted this huge draft that reached into the heart of the nation and transformed it, but you did have a mass volunteer experience, at least especially in like the Midwest and the South, where you had huge numbers of volunteers signing up for this war and following the war, being engaged in the war. It really did produce on the kind of cultural and media levels that kind of galvanizing energy that you see only in later wars, nowhere else.
And among those people who were at least partially galvanized, that you mentioned earlier, and I found this fascinating, the Mormons. This is the precise period when the Mormons are in the process of moving out to their imagined Zion in Utah after Joseph Smith has been shot down like a dog. But in order to gain federal support for their westward migration, Brigham Young has a Mormon battalion drawn up that ends up marching from Iowa to San Diego over the course of the war. And,
hell of a road trip.
Yeah, I mean, pretty impressive.
Hell of a hike.
Yeah. At one point, they bump into the Donner Party. People who get discharged from it end up being amongst the first people to discover gold at Sutter's Mill. It's definitely a sort of a Forrest Gumpian journey for the men of the Mormon battalion there.
I wonder if there was a Mormon Bilbo who rode there and back again from his little dwelling in Iowa.
Yes. Yeah. But yeah, so that just goes to show how it becomes this national. It really does become a national campaign and there's nothing we love more than kicking the shit out of another country. It makes us remember why we're in this in the first place.
I suppose.
But I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the figures of incompetence that sort of it spoils the broth a little bit. It's also the guy who is credited with making the war happen in the first place, President Polk, because his management of the war it's micromanaging, it's deeply politicized.
Yeah.
And it also includes a hilarious sort of sealed train to Finland Station thing with Santa Anna that ends up prolonging the war significantly?
Totally. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Well, yeah, because Polk, you have a, antebellum republic where the warmongers are Democrats and the war personnel are Whigs,
Right, yeah, Winfield Scott, famously, yes.
So all the generals,
and Zachary
Taylor, Winfield Scott, several others at the top of the military brass are either Whig, either like actual sort of on the red line Whig, or just vaguely Whiggish. That's Robert E. Lee, for instance, who's gets his spurs, serving under Scott, and basically there's a profound distrust between that sort of Whiggish army elite and the sort of West Point brass and
the deep state, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. The 1846 deep state. Which didn't, Polk was trying to drain that swamp, and so he's trying to promote. I mean, there is a Trumpian element to this. He's trying. He works hard to try to get his Democratic generals in there. I mean, this is an element of that also you can find in every American war. Certainly, the Civil War, there were plenty of political generals. There will always be political generals, but there's some cartoonish ones where Polk appoints. I think Gideon. Is it? Does he actually appoint? I think it's Gideon Pillow, who later had a fort named after him, where black troops are murdered during the Civil War. He's just a total Democrat bumpkin who, bombs when he's deployed. You had, Franklin Pierce, actually, later U.S. president was a kind of political general from New Hampshire, got there via, Democratic Party connections.
He traveled from battle to battle in a barrel of tequila.
I think the only action he saw, they said, was when he fell off his horse. The hero of many bottles. So these Whig generals, so there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of static between the Polk administration, Secretary of War Marcy, Secretary of State Buchanan, all these Democratic kind of, you can't really say they're fighting the deep state because they are the ruling, kind of administrative personnel of DC, even though they also kind of hate administration. But anyway, all of these apparatchiks are there, and the generals, are, these Whig generals are vain and grandstanding in very different ways. Taylor is rumpled and kind of gritty, but totally stubborn and, obsessed with his own ideas about what to do, constantly, improvising and, sort of he captures Monterey and he offers this very generous armistice, and Polk's pissed about that. But none of the guys in Washington really know what the situation is like on the ground, and the communications aren't that good. And then on the higher political level, what you talk about, it's amazing. So they're trying to figure out, they don't really want to conquer. Polk doesn't actually want to do a full scale. There are factions in the Democratic Party that do. I don't think Polk is one of them. Want a full scale conquest of Mexico. There is an all Mexico movement and so on. But I think the kind of majority of Democrats want something like actually Calhoun's formula, even though he doesn't get along with Polk either, which is, loosely stated, the maximum of Mexico and the minimum of Mexicans, which is, in their eyes, basically the borders that we got, the Rio Grande west to California. Sometimes they want Baja California. Sometimes, the border is a bit farther north and it's just, San Francisco Bay and downward. Some interesting counterfactuals there, although I kind of feel like the U.S. was coming for San Diego and Los Angeles anyway. But anyway, so in other words, the big strategic issue for the Americans when the war starts is, how do we compel a peace from Mexico? So Polk kind of Taylor kind of meanders into northern Mexico towards Monterey, fights a couple battles, pushes the Mexican army back, takes Monterey, and then kind of just sits there, because at that point he's got to march another hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to even the next significant strategic point. His supply lines are already in ribbons. And it's not really clear. The Mexican government is showing no signs of coming to the negotiating table. So meanwhile, you have this on again, off again hero villain of Mexican politics, Santa Anna, who's been in bed with the conservatives, who's been in bed with the liberals, currently out of power, kind of chilling in Havana. And he's sending his emissaries to Polk saying, hey, let me in, I'll make a peace. So the U.S. government basically does, exactly what the Bolsheviks did. I mean, what the Imperial Germany did in the First World War, where they're like, hey, let's send all the agitators, let's send all of the the troublemakers and the potential peacemakers to the internal enemies of the state, to our opposing parties. So they send all the Bolsheviks back, across the front to Russia to help bring down the regime, which works. And the U.S. did the same with Santa Anna. There's actually some good comedy about, or mildly good comedy there. He's in Havana, and they send a U.S. naval commander. I mean, it's secret diplomacy, because it's like what they're doing is trying to install a puppet who's the most famous political leader of the era. So it's kind of hard to do it covertly, but they don't do it very well. This naval commander, who's actually famous for putting down the only mutiny in U.S. naval history, which Melville wrote his story Billy Budd about. This guy, Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, total hard ass. He just hires a coach in Havana in full dress uniform and goes up to Santa Anna's house and is like, okay, here are the conditions. We'll bring you to Mexico, and you'll take over, and you'll sell us your territory, right? And Santa Anna's like, well, with the Texas border, why do you guys claim the Rio Grande again? That doesn't make any sense. And he's like, well, because we want it. And Santa Anna's like, all right, deal. And they put him on a British ship. And, the U.S. has this extensive blockade of the coast. The whole Navy is in the Gulf of Mexico. They just let Santa Anna waltz on through, and he shows up. And then, of course, he gets there. He's actually, at this time, sort of interesting, and I'd like to know more about this. He makes an alliance with the kind of most ultra-liberal of the Mexicans, this guy Gomez Farias, who is the most sort of decentralized, very anti-clerical, very kind of Enlightenment liberal, but also kind of a populist figure in that way that, liberal populism was a thing in Mexico, kind of the masses rather than the grandes and the church leaders. Santa Anna, Gomez Farias is like ruling in Mexico City, and Santa Anna goes to the front. It's like, you fight, I'll govern. There's actually Gomez Farias is interesting. Hopefully you'll get somebody on the pod who knows more about the Mexican history, because that's an interesting combo. I mean, obviously Santa Anna is a total opportunist and is doing anything he can to stay in power. And he resolves, not only does he welch on the deal, he summons the most extensive Mexican counterattack, really the only counterattack of the war. He leads a huge force against Taylor. And at Buena Vista, he gives him a hell of a fight. It's a really serious, bloody battle on both sides. Eventually, he's repulsed, but only after some serious hard fighting. And I don't want to say it really could have gone the other way, but the hundreds dead at Buena Vista are completely on James K. Polk for this Santa Anna intrigue.
Pobungler, we called him. But of course, we must stress that, yes, there's some heavy fighting, some pitched battles, but the vast majority of troops died of crapping themselves. As was true in the Civil War, it would be true in most wars until the antibiotic revolution. The most common way you're going to die in the American Army of the Mexican War is shitting in a ditch.
Second most common, probably in this case, was dying of yakking, of the vomito, the yellow fever. Yeah. Which comes in big in Veracruz. Yeah,
I'm always kind of amazed that they're able to get people to go fight in these wars, because the idea of dying in battle, I think, does have, for young men specifically, a certain romance, and it can get them out the door. I do wonder if they knew how much more likely they were to die shitting, how much they would have been willing to go to war for that. Because it does seem like it's very hard to imagine any romance.
It's true. You can't have a Call of Duty dysentery edition. It doesn't work. You're confined to your tent.
Press X to shit yourself again. Yeah. You're just banging on the button. Like, I remember you told me that that a Christman was the first guy buried in Arlington. Yes. I was like, oh, cool. And I look it up. It's like dysentery. It's like, fuck.
Yeah, he was there like a month.
You couldn't have caught a Minet ball or something. You had to just be shitting.
Yeah. No, I think the conditions in Mexico are arguably even worse than. I guess it depends. Maybe some of the Confederates had it worse, but the U.S. Army in Mexico did a lot of occupying. It fought a few battles, and then it did a lot of depredations on the countryside. It did a lot of pillaging. It did a lot of there's plenty of atrocity stories. It did a lot of frisking of random frisking of priests and things like that. There's plenty of anti-Catholicism going on.
Which led to, in my mind, one of the most fascinating events in it, or really any American war, which is the defection of the Shamrock Battalion.
Yeah, amazing. Great stuff. I mean, you actually struggle to think about how this could work in any other war, but basically it's a group of 150-ish, mostly Irish Catholics who are in one way or another, conscripted or maybe sort of volunteered out of, sheer poverty into the U.S. Army.
That was the number one motivator then as now. You couldn't get a Dodge Charger or a communications degree, but they would give you some hardtack and a place to sleep.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you didn't even get health insurance then. The call was weaker. But anyway, yeah. So within weeks, I mean, so under these conditions, first of all, it must be said, the desertion rate is huge, especially in Taylor's army in northern Mexico, which does a lot of sitting around. And even in the early days, even after these kind of triumphant victories, the conditions are so miserable, and the whole thing is so sort of thinly policed and surveilled, and the American military, sledgehammer touch. I mean, that is one significant difference. American wars in the 20th century, if you were doing this kind of huge imperial overseas effort, you have, just the bureaucrats that go along with the army, the guys in the rear with the gear. You really didn't have much of that. That was the problem. They didn't have enough gear. And as a result, it was a lot easier to slip away. So of these deserters, the most interesting are about 150 up to 200, mostly Irish Catholic, although some German immigrants were in there. I was looking at it. There were some Scots. There were a range of deserters, one or two African Americans, who are in the region, working in some capacity with the army, who slip over to and sign up as a brigade to fight for the Mexicans under as the St. Patrick's, but the San Patricio Battalion, as they say.
How'd they do?
And yeah, they fly. They have a shamrock flag, and the Kelly Green. There's this guy John Riley is their commander, and they fight like intensely. Every record I've read of this is like they were one of the most devoted units. A lot of the Mexican soldiers, they're completely conscripted peasants who have almost no stake in this war. Maybe they hate the Yankees, but they're also involved in, they hate the centralists just as much. They hate, various factions of American politics, local politics. They hate their local grande. They hate their neighbor. Not very political, not very committed to the war, and so don't always offer the most determined resistance. Same thing with the officer class, frankly, in the Mexican army, very erratic. And the San Patricios have a stake somehow in this. And yeah, I was reading at Churubusco, which is one of the bloodier engagements in the Scots campaign towards Mexico City. The officer kill rate in the American army is huge, and you have a sense that these guys are actually just aiming to kill American officers in combat with the Shamrock Brigade. So in the end, it's not really a happy ending. They mostly get captured, and there's 50 of them are hung up and executed by the U.S. Army. It's the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Not the Lakota that were hung in the Dakota War, in the Civil War, the largest one-off. But all these guys were hung over the course of a couple days as part of one unit, tried and won as a body. It's pretty grim, but the penalty for desertion in wartime was death.
It's true. You got to figure that phenomenon would have been a nice back pocket propaganda for the nativists in America. Like these guys literally gave them guns, and they literally just ran away and joined the Mexicans.
They would. I mean,
because they love the Pope so goddamn much.
They do. I mean, I think there were it's hard to know whether it was just desperation or kind of tedium or a genuine kind of Catholic sense of oppressed nation under the power of this arrogant Anglo-Saxon dominator. It's hard to say. It is kind of funny to imagine versions of this in other wars. Like imagine like 150 U.S. soldiers slipping away to join like the Republican Guard and become like the most determined outposts of like Baathism in 2003. That would have been interesting.
Yeah, 2, 3 many John Walker Lynns. That would have been great. Like,
yeah.
A Taliban unit of pissed off American teenagers.
Yeah, that's what you would have needed. You would have needed like basically the Grey Wolf Brigade. That it'd be ripe for recruitment, especially if Felix offered to lead like a Baathist. I think the religious stuff is harder because there isn't that connection. But if you have some sort of vague secular nationalist thing that's like anti-American, It really, I actually can see Baathism having a kind of ideological lure over disaffected, Zoomers and millennials.
I mean, if my perusal of memes tells me anything, it's that is absolutely true. That there's definitely a Baath appeal that could have been made. If Saddam had put more money into PSYOPs, he might have been able to get some sort of fifth column going of people.
Yeah, I got the what's his name?
Shooting the gold-plated AKs. Like, come on, that's cooler than George W. Bush any day of the week.
Like what would you call it? Like the Nasser Brigade or the I don't know what like the who was Baghdad Bob? What was his name? The propaganda minister. Do you guys remember?
I just remember them calling him Baghdad Bob.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Mohammed Saeed Al-Saf.
Okay, all right. Anyway, but yeah, they should have.
See, I don't think they could have named it after him because he was cringe.
Everyone he was cringe. It would have been
not telling the
Sons. The Sons.
Uday and Kusei. Now we're talking.
Yeah,
those guys. There's some charisma.
The Uday Kusei Brze, the UQers.
Yeah.
Everyone remembers. We could just write that Wikipedia entry now, and who would know? The UQers, disaffected youths from Louisville and
America's suburbs,
Appleton, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Anyway, but this really happened in the war with Mexico, and it is notable. I mean, it's a reminder alongside the Mormon stuff of like kind of how, if you will, like ethnically, religiously chaotic this landscape of 19th century North America was, where all sorts of weird alliances and configurations were possible. It's like the same thing with the Fenians in the Civil War, where you have Confederates teaming up with them in Canada to like rob banks in Vermont and so on, and cause trouble for the Union Army on the basis of some kind of anti-U.S. government, anti-Anglo alliance. You have a lot of, especially on the margins, which is, in fairness, most of the continent at this point. You have a lot of possibilities for different sorts of permutations than our kind of strict, ideological, a sort of simplified register of just like America's march over the continent would have you think.
So obviously, you had the Shamrock guys being deeply disillusioned by their part of the war, but then also they're also not happy about it, but also not unhappy enough to do anything about it. We have U.S. Grant, one of many future Civil War figures who cut their teeth in the Mexican War, and who afterwards
heroics.
He was doing what?
He was doing heroics too, Grant. I mean, he wasn't. I mean, Robert E. Lee was like sneaking across the desert to set up a cannon. Grant was like riding horses, like two horses, one on each leg. Kind of doing. He was doing like Chinese martial arts stuff. He was
doing wire fu. Yeah.
in combat in I think he was also in the Scott Army, or was he in Taylor's army? I can't remember. Anyway, he saw intense action.
And after the war, he claimed that there was never a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. And he said that at the time I thought it then, but I had not the moral courage enough to resign. That's what he said. Also, he had no other skills or idea on what to do with himself.
We saw what happened to him after he did resign, or rather was
gently shown the door of the tent.
Gently shown the door of the tent,
shit-faced.
Yeah, he was a drunken saddle maker, or a drunken leather worker in Galena. Yeah.
I mean, his reputation for being drunk mostly stems from the period after the war when he was manning those posts in California, and there's like nobody there. Like, if you don't have a smartphone, the 19th century version of that would have been a bottle of whiskey.
Yeah,
there's nothing else to do.
Yeah, there's not even porn. It's true. He didn't. There was just nothing. I mean, I guess you could go out. I mean, the other thing that was available was murdering indigenous.
That's it. That wasn't much fun. It's too squeamish.
Yeah, that wasn't Grant's thing. But yeah, there wasn't a lot. There wasn't a lot. Yeah, I don't think it's true. I shouldn't slander one of the greats in Galena. I think he was actually relatively sober. Just a total failure.
Shitty.
Of business. Yeah, just shitty.
He couldn't even blame the alcohol for being bad at saddle making.
Just kind of clinging to his father-in-law's like modest largesse. Yeah, that's it.
So who else we got coming up there? Who else is in the Mexican War? Who ends up showing
Beauregard's
up
there. Beauregard was there. A lot of the B grade guys. I'm actually trying to remember. I should know this. I don't think McClellan was there. He's too young.
Yeah, he was.
I should know this better. Was Sherman there?
That's a good question.
This is where I didn't hit all these guys. There's books written on
He
this
did not
stuff.
see action. No, he was in Northern California.
Okay. Yeah, because I don't have a
He was
sense.
dicking around in the Bay Area, apparently.
But yeah, a lot of the kind of like division commanders and stuff, a lot of the top brass, mostly underneath Taylor and Scott, they were kind of the aged. It was that same sort of Winfield Scott role, that aged generation that was kind of loosely pushed out right at the war began. Like this guy David Twiggs, who was one of the important commanders was a Georgian who was in Texas in 1860 and was the big commander in Texas who just gave all where there was actually some unionist sentiment and a unionist governor, Sam Houston, in 1861, and Twiggs completely gave away the ghost and just handed everything to the Texas Rangers. But he never really did much for the Confederacy because he was just old balls at that point. It's really the Civil War. The top Civil War guys were like, they were like lieutenants basically at this point.
So it's as we've alluded to, it's essentially a two-pronged invasion of Mexico. Taylor moving the north to south, and then Scott, after the amphibious landing, going overland, east to west, and taking Veracruz. And then finally, in September of 1847, taking Mexico, or Mexico City.
Yeah, it's really an impressive undertaking in the kind of technical sense. Scott was he would have loved Excel. He was that kind of guy. He was a planner. He was meticulous, old fuss and feathers. He was vain, physically vain, large, imposing man. Actually had served all the way since the War of 1812. Had a really extended Civil War career before his final kind of comic deployment in 1861 when he is so gout ridden he can barely even walk to the meetings with Lincoln at the beginning of the war. But he was a tactical, I think it's fair to say, I don't know, genius, but he was impressive tactical commander, sort of organizing all of this, helped by the sort of even the early vestiges of the war machine. But yeah, Veracruz is a hard city to take because they have this massive castle, San Juan de Ula, or I said that horribly wrong, San Juan de Ulua. Anyway, let's not try to say that a third time. They have a big castle looking over the harbor that's like totally impregnable, apparently to ship to bombardment. And it's not an easy, it's not like the U.S. had a lot of experience doing amphibious landings in a totally hostile environment. But they assemble a massive flotilla, again, for the time, but it is massive. And by anyone's estimation, in a contemporary sense, and they just bomb the hell out of Veracruz. I mean, they do a classic kind of, shock and awe. This is what the U.S. Army does best: is lob shit at cities from very far away, and bombs going off in marketplaces. Yeah, of course they're aiming for munition stuff, but I mean, if you want to talk about collateral damage in there wasn't even any dogma of like smart bombs at this point. It's just fire away with the heavy guns. And so Veracruz surrenders more quickly than expected under this very intense heavy bombardment, and they end up the Mexicans, even in their sort of strong fortified castle, end up yielding. And so then once Scott gets to Veracruz, he takes a long time. I mean, he's not quick. This is not lightning war. He takes 6 months to meticulously wind his way up. He wants to get out of Veracruz pretty quickly to avoid the yellow fever, but then he gets up into the highlands and he really takes his time. And Santa Anna, I don't want to say to his credit, but Santa Anna is giving him, heavy static at every way. There's Scott. It's not a cakewalk into Mexico City. Scott has to fight at Cerro Gordo. He has to fight at Churubusco. He has to fight outside the gates of Mexico City. 6 months later, he finally gets there. Actually, basically not so differently, retreading the route that Cortez took, when he was on his way to sort of make the conquest of the Aztecs in a resonance that is not lost on these Americans. I think Polk, before office, this is a very Trump move. He gets a picture. So one of the generals gives him a picture of Cortez and he hangs it in the Oval Office as a kind of, sort of acknowledged reference to, I'm the new Cortez. And Mexicans also sort of talk about this as a sort of a new invasion on the model of Cortez. And yeah, it's bloody and it's time consuming, but Scott manages to sort of make his way through those mountains across difficult terrain and sees the halls of the Montezumas, another phrase that then becomes etched in the U.S. Marine song or whatever. It's these resonances from Cortez and the Aztecs, and then then there's a whole other story about how just like Taylor's army took Monterrey and sat there for a long time, Scott's army takes Mexico City and sits there for the better part of a year. As the Mexican government has basically collapsed, but it's very difficult to figure out how the end game after the invasion.
But what we get finally in February of 1848 is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives to the United States California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Just a huge buff of America's stats across the board there in the West. And sets the stage for a political battle over what to do with those territories, and also sets the stage for generations of political instability in Mexico itself after that.
Most of the Pac-10, the better part of the Big 12, and then not to mention the WAC and the Mountain West Conference. So, I mean, imagine sports, without Southern California and Oklahoma,
They'd all be playing soccer. There'd be no high school football or college football to be found. It'd be horrible.
Yeah. So this is contentious because there's different factions in Washington that want different things, and there are some, especially a lot of the most gung ho on this are the Northwesterners. That is like the sort of Ohio and the sort of the Democrats, the expansionist Democrats from Ohio to Wisconsin, who are the sort of the heartbeat, with a few Southerners, of the All Mexico movement that want in these negotiations to say, hey, look, we conquered Mexico City. Let's take the whole shebang. Let's set up shop over this entire continent south of Canada up to the Yucatan Peninsula, which was also, by the way, in revolt against the state of Mexico, which had its own problems. I mean, we haven't even mentioned that most of this territory, a huge part of West Texas and what is now New Mexico up into Colorado and then deep into northern Mexico, was really effectively controlled by Comanches at this point. The Mexican state had a really limited purchase on a lot of this land. And the kind of the ongoing Comanche raids across the 20s, 30s, and 40s really opened the door in some ways for weakening the sort of what had once been, at least by some accounts, the Mexican army had its strongest presence in northern Mexico, partly to clamp down on the restive natives, but that is both the local Mexicans and Native Americans who are fighting with the Mexican state or conducting raids. But really, the Comanches have left a lot of Mexican defenses in a shell. But alternatively, once the U.S. takes over, the Comanches themselves are a bit worn out, and the way this land is all rolled up into U.S. territory, a huge chunk of it, kind of helps facilitate a massive seizure of land from Native people too across this period, which I guess we should mention as part of this war. I have a colleague, a guy at Columbia, who's writing a book on the U.S. Mexico War, precisely as a kind of, this guy Carl Jacoby, as a war, against Native Americans too, which like the War of 1812 was the Creek War, and was about as much about fighting Britain as it was, clearing out Alabama from the natives. The War of Mexico, similar function, especially in the Southwest. Anyway, all that being said, the U.S. is, after some serious revolts in Taos and in Los Angeles, among other places, is back firmly in control of all of the land that is now the U.S. And so it's hard to imagine an agreement being made at this point after all this bloodshed that wouldn't have included that land. The question is the rest of Mexico. And in the end, the envoy that they send, this guy Nicholas Trist, the instructions from Washington are vague and conflicting, and he ends up making an agreement that is Guadalupe Hidalgo, that is the borders we know now. Polk hates it, but he has to swallow it. The bulk of the country wants peace, and they want this land, and it's a relatively cheap price too.
And everything was fine after that. That's the thing to remember most importantly.
Yeah, exactly. They all lived happily ever after. The forbidden fruit went down deliciously, just like that Palo Alto root beer.
All right.
No conflicts on the horizon for the United States.
No, it's all smooth sailing after that.
Yeah.
That'll do it for now, I think. In future episodes, I think we'll talk about what came next, what's where we ended up. Can't wait to talk about one of my favorite incidents in Mexican history. Good old Maximilian, the poor Austrian chump, just stitched up by Napoleon III and left to get shot down like a dog.
Man, I want to hear you do your epic German accent, but with a Spanish accent on top of it, like Maximilian speaking to his people. I'd love that. Work that out.
That's definitely going to go over well when I do that.
Yeah.
And that is all a direct consequence of this massive dismembering of a country that was already sort of in a debt imperialist relationship with European powers before the war, and then became basically a in hoc to the French afterwards, to the point where the mad lad Napoleon III actually tried to bust through the Monroe Corridor because he thought that he thought the Civil War would just go on forever and that we'd never fix it, and no one would notice. But of course, that's not what happened. But that's for a future episode. For now, thank you very much, Matt, for talking us through this one.
Yeah, good times. Let's break open some root beer.
Honestly, now I haven't had root beer in forever. I would love some.
Yeah, no, I'm getting thirsty. We have to pray. Let us pray.
On a hot afternoon of May 10th, 1931, some army officers, grieving the end of the reign of their lately deposed king, met in a clubhouse in the Spanish capital of Madrid and took to drink. They also took to song, playing the Royal March on phonographs, opening their windows and blasting it out into the street. Passers-by, typical of Madrileños whose families owned no land and swore no oath of loyalty to the king, were still giddy with the arrival of the Second Spanish Republic. The Republic promised a relief to the dire circumstances of their lives, as exhausted laborers, or downtrodden clerks, or henpecked waiters, a promise to dignify labor with recompense, and banish the faint whispers of a hunger that never quite left them. That bellowing royal march was a haughty reply from the forces of traditional order that none of these promises would be kept. The army, packed with monarchist officers, would see to that. In the day's heat, fighting broke out between the Madrileños and the army officers, the common people of the city against the armed emissaries of the landowners of the country. Soon the violence spread across the city as the people of that city mobilized to strike against their enemies. The news of the riot shot through fresh veins of communication infrastructure to cities and even villages across the Spanish countryside. Fires lighted in thousands of ready hearts. They were out to assert themselves against the one institution whose injustice and oppression transcended geographic region or sector of employment. An institution that, unlike the buildings of the government, was largely left unguarded. So crowds gathered at the churches and convents that dominated the culture of Spain, where God's spokesman consecrated as holy their unending suffering. Now, most city dwellers and the poor of the villages, who had not inherited a trade from their artisan forebears, were the children of peasants who'd been driven from the land and into wage labor on farms or cities. These were the children who had made the terrible journey into the unknown. They had encountered a world starkly different from their lives in the villages, and from this new angle, the eternal truths of the church were exposed as the lies of an antichrist who worked to keep them in chains. Contempt for the church was not constrained to the laboring classes either. For the more educated professionals of the city, the church stood for medieval superstition that lay like a yoke around the neck of Spain. Whatever the source of disgust, the newly established republic provided a political outlet for generations of visceral hatred for the symbols, infrastructure, and above all personnel of the Catholic Church. So in the next 2 days, over 200 churches, convents, and religious buildings were burned in cities and villages across southern Spain. The crowds burned churches to display their loyalty to the Republic, which represented a path to the establishment of a true faith, a faith in the common people's fitness to rule themselves. They also acted, though, because burning churches was a traditional form of entertainment in Spain, and had been since the 19th century, when the authority and credibility of the clerical class with the landless was permanently shattered. Priests were corrupt and cynical creatures of the lords who had cast them off the land. If people were excited, burning down their houses sent a good message, and it was a damn fun time. The church burnings were a portent for the future of the, spoiler alert, short-lived Second Spanish Republic. The introduction of mass democracy to a population suffering deep immiseration and apocalyptic inequality, a population with no prospect of imperial spoils to ease the pain and provide social purpose, meant that political change was always occurring in the aftermath of spontaneous violence generated by unrestrained class conflict. Other Western European nations had developed strong central authorities capable of arranging the various carrots and sticks necessary to secure class peace. Incapable of competing with those other states for colonial markets, Spain needed to modernize its economy to assert its interests within the world capitalist system. The Republic would survive only if it could build the state capacity to channel the heat radiating off of this class conflict into economic productivity and away from cycles of ritualistic civic violence. Unfortunately, the Republic lacked any symbol capable of stretching across Spain's political divide, because the last mystic knot tying the modern Spanish state to the glories of the Spanish Empire from the time before the intrusion of capitalism had just been cut. A month before the churches burned, on April 14th, 1931, Alfonso Leon Fernando Maria Jaime Isidor Pascuala Antonio de Borbón y Habsburgo Lorena, aka King Alfonso XIII of Spain, departed the country for foreign exile. Municipal election results, which had seen huge anti-monarchical majorities in Spain's cities, coupled with waves of student strikes and a show of no confidence from his generals, drove King Alfonso from the throne. Liberal and socialist political leaders, who had come together the year before to form the Republican Pact of San Sebastian, seized the moment to declare a second Spanish Republic. Now you're probably asking, what about that first Spanish Republic? Well, it only lasted from February 1874 to December 1875 before being brought down by a military coup. In Spanish tradition, they're called pronunciamentos, or pronouncements, and they happen so often that they have their own special name. The military had been the final arbiter of Spanish politics since the Napoleonic invasion of 1809 shattered the ancient regime. The classes of Spanish society who placed their hope in the Second Republic, the liberal cosmopolitans of the urban small bourgeois, the organized urban workers, and those millennium-seeking rural proletarians, were all united in their hope of seeing this republic withstand the test of time. Only through the instrument of the republic would Spain be delivered into the condition of a modern country while honoring the humanity of her citizenry. The military had stood by while Alfonso fell, which proved that while it's a conservative institution, it was not existentially hostile to the republic. They're waiting to see what'll happen. But the reactionary character of the Spanish officer corps, which is almost entirely drawn from the ranks of the rural landowning class who saw the monarchs as the guarantors of their property and rights, meant that the army would always be a sword pointed at the republic's throat, unless the republic built sufficient legitimacy across Spanish society that the military wouldn't dare challenge it. Spaniards had a republic now if they could keep it. To that end, the political parties, which had been repressed under the regime of the dictator General Miguel Primo de Rivera that had preceded the republic, sprung into action, sending organizers, agitators, and propagandists from the cities out into the Spanish countryside, where half the population lived in villages of fewer than 5,000 people. For many of them, this would be their first encounter with politics as a participatory exercise. For generations, political power in rural Spain, where the population consisted mostly of small subsistence farmers and landless farm laborers who worked to bring in the harvests on the estates of absentee estate owners, had been held by bosses called caciques. The jobs of these caciques was to harmonize the interests of the political parties in Madrid with those of the local landowners, dispensing patronage and threats of violence to secure the bulk vote of a population who largely suffered under what are essentially medieval social conditions. Now, the advent of mass communication in the form of film and radio, the transportation revolution of automobile travel, and the development of modern working class parties and trade unions meant that the poor of the countryside became for the first time modern political subjects. The Socialist Party and its affiliated union, the General Union of Workers, which in Spanish acronym is UGT, built casas de pueblos, or houses of the people, in these villages that served as organizing hubs to rival the political clubs of the landowners. Now, in these casas de pueblo, organizers showed movies, gave lectures, and coordinated labor actions. For the landowners and middle classes of the villages, this was an invasion of interlopers with heads full of French liberalism and Jewish Bolshevism, creating social conflict where before there had been placid harmony, all to the end of destroying everything good and lasting about Spain. Now, to the poor farmers and landless laborers, this was an opportunity to grasp their own destinies and assert their dignity in the face of generations of misery and oppression. Of these two perspectives, the poor one, at least, had the benefit of clarity. The comfortable lives of the professionals and propertied blinded them to the fact that Spain's future health depended above all on the reform of agriculture and land tenure. Spain depended on agricultural exports for the bulk of its economy, and Spanish agriculture was among the least efficient in Europe. If Spain continued to languish under depression conditions, the Republic would lose any popular legitimacy. Lacking capital to invest in industrial production and lacking the administrative capacity to enforce higher production at gunpoint, the government would need to boost the fortunes of the rural population to secure its future. More mechanization and efficiency in agriculture creates less need for workers, which pushes workers into industrial labor in the cities. Hypothetically. So, in 1931, Spain had a new, untested representative government, an economy suffering from a cycle of underdevelopment and the effects of a global depression, and violent social conflict escalating at every level of society. Meanwhile, every other so-called advanced capitalist state in the world faced their own particular internal crisis brought on by the global economic collapse. For most of the 30s, the countries of Europe avoided open-class warfare through electoral and military improvisation. And these improvisations brought the continent to a perfect domestic and foreign state of tension. The quote-unquote Western democracies were seeing vast mobilization of workers through the electoral process, and the fascist states had suppressed their class conflict only by ratcheting up their conflict with the other states of Europe. Everyone is holding their breath for the first thread to snap. That it was Spain who broke first can be explained by Spain's specific conditions of combined and uneven development and the fundamental inability of the liberalized Spanish state to reform the basis of their economy, agriculture. Charting the road to the Second Republic, and thus to the Civil War, begins with this question. To this point, the story of the failure of Spanish agricultural reform had also been the story of the failure of the Spanish liberal project. So Spain was the first early modern European hegemon. But the elites who made up that hegemony, the military commanders who were granted royal authority over land and people in exchange for military support of the king, those people, the same ones who had first made the reconquest of Iberia and then the conquest of Latin America, would be the ones who ended up breaking that hegemony. The other powers of Europe, forced to reorient themselves to check Spanish power or be destroyed, unleashed within their own countries social forces that transformed their social structures. But there was no force within Spain that was powerful enough to challenge the authority of those local landowning elites, and the transformation to capitalism that defined Northern Europe was forcefully resisted in Spain. As a result, Spain gradually lost diplomatic and political influence until by the mid-18th century it was a second-rate power. The reformer King Charles III attempted to rouse the Spanish nobility from its self-satisfied slumber, but he was broadly defeated by the elites in the New World and the Old, who were able to effectively defend their prerogatives. It took an invasion from Napoleon's energetic, dynamic French First Empire to shock the Spanish elite into motion. Now, as resistance to French occupation grew, the struggle created leaders who saw the awesome social power unleashed by political liberalism in France, power sufficient to sweep across their borders and dominate their country. And they began working to liberalize Spain in the French model so that they would more effectively be able to compete with France and keep France from kicking their door in whenever they felt like it. But with a rural population that was illiterate and politically inert, and an aristocracy that was fat and self-satisfied, and a bourgeois that was almost non-existent, liberalism lacked a popular constituency. It would emerge within the organization that had to most suffer the consequences of this Spanish stagnation, which is the military, the guys who actually got their asses kicked by the French. And they thought liberalism was a solution to getting their ass kicked all the time. By 1820, the weakness of the central government had inspired independence movements in all the colonies of Central and South America. In Cadiz, in southern Spain, which is Spain's principal Atlantic port, officers and conscripts were mustering for deployment in the rest of colonies. Suffering the irregular pay, bad and inadequate food, and the prospect of malarial death in the jungles of the New World, the soldiers mutinied. It was from this nucleus of radicals that eventually came a demand: the institution of the liberal Cadiz Constitution that had been drafted during the French War by liberal army officers and was never recognized by King Ferdinand. French military intervention had spawned Spanish liberalism, and it was a French military intervention that squashed it 3 years after the Cadiz Mutiny, when the restored French Bourbons sent the 100,000 Sons of Saint Louis, a military formation, to overthrow the Spanish liberal government and reinstate the absolutist rule of their cousin Ferdinand. So the Cadiz Mutiny unleashes the forces of liberalism in Spain. But in so doing, it also dooms it, because it's the mutiny. It is the Cadiz Mutiny that destroys the crown's credibility in Latin America and made defending the Spanish government more and more untenable for New World elites. And so that meant that soon after the Cadiz Mutiny, the colonies were all able to affect the pretensions of their independence. Without the ability to displace exploitation onto colonial lands, liberalism could not gain social legitimacy, and the rational organs of market-based administration prized by liberals would struggle to take hold. So Cadiz dooms the Spanish Empire, and without an empire, you cannot peacefully impose liberalism on a pre-liberal subjectivity.
El hombre lo que quiere es su pan. Las habladurías le bastan ya, porque estas nada le dan.
So the liberals get their next bite of the apple in 1833, when Ferdinand dies without male issue. He set aside the Salic law that said only sons could rule and allowed his eldest daughter Isabella to inherit the throne. And the dead king's younger brother Carlos, pointing to the tradition, disputed the succession. Naturally, around these culture war poles, the liberals ended up supporting Isabella, while Carlos led an army made up of the fiercely reactionary, small-holding peasants of Navarre, a former kingdom in its own right in the foothills of the Pyrenees bordering France. So we've talked about the exploited landless laborers of the South, but that did not define the condition of every farmer in Spain. In Navarre, you have a tradition of self-sufficient, small-holding peasants who are able to make a life for themselves on plots of land sufficient for their family to work, which means that they don't have to hire themselves out as laborers and they don't have to hire laborers. So the notion of a rural idol is real. They live the rural fantasy of what feudalism is supposed to be. And so they see liberalism as a direct challenge on a social order that to them is the very mind of God. It is God's will on earth for the world to be like that. And so it's these guys who are sort of like Spanish Spartans. They fight on behalf of God and the eternal Spanish values that they associated with their independence and prosperity, and against this godless foreign imported liberalism. And those guys are the shock troops of what becomes known as the Carlist Army, which fights a nearly decade-long war with the liberal Spanish state. So without colonies and with a stagnant quasi-feudal mode of production dominating Spanish agriculture, Isabella's liberal regime lacked the funds to fight the Carlists. There were, though, 10,000 liberal British volunteers. This is a way to remind you that at one time, liberalism was a fighting faith. And one of the groups that fought on its behalf were 10,000 British liberals who were so into John Stuart Mill that they were willing to die at the end of Carlist bayonets. Well, they weren't sufficient, though. They weren't going to do it by themselves. To raise money and to bring market forces to bear in the countryside, the liberals finally brought the Reformation to Spain by forcing the sale of lands held by the Catholic Church and by municipalities. Now, this has the added benefit of reducing the social power of the church, which existed as an instrument of landowner dominance across the country. A mark of that power is that in exchange for allowing all these lands to be sold, the church was guaranteed continued control of education and cultural life in Spain, and the clergy were given permanent government pensions backed by government bonds. So they were essentially bought out of their share of Spanish land. The Carlist War was eventually won by Isabella's liberal forces, and after winning, they did the same thing to the Carlists that they did to the church, which was buy them out. The Carlist officer corps was absorbed into the Spanish army, and pensions were dispensed in the same way that they were to the clergy. But that transformation of Spanish agriculture they were hoping to go along with it did not follow victory. So the lands had been sold to the highest bidders, who were usually members of Spain's thin strata of bourgeois capitalists. Now, the regime had hoped that they would bring modern agricultural methods and markets to the countryside. They would bring a Protestant work ethic to the countryside and do the same thing there that had happened to the English countryside centuries earlier. But the thing is, rural Spain did not have the robust credit networks or infrastructure that would have made reinvestment in new crops and the purchase of machinery worthwhile. What it did have, though, was a huge overabundance of cheap labor. A lot of landless workers called braceros who were totally at the mercy of the landowners. So with labor that cheap, it was a much better proposition for these landowners to just act like the old landowners, which is use cheap labor, do not do any improvements or innovations in efficiency, and just take a bigger and bigger share of their labor. Just hyper-exploit the peasantry. What's the point of investing in something where there's a limit to how much you're going to ever be able to marketize a country where market structures haven't been built? So the new landowners start acting like the old landowners. They spent the surplus created by their tenants and hired laborers on magnificent villas and in conspicuous consumption in the casinos and theaters of the provincial capitals, and in Madrid most of all. The shrinking aristocracy was able to expand itself by offering titles to these new neighbors, and the economic transformation in the countryside stalled out. But that doesn't mean that the sale of church and municipal lands didn't have a profound effect on Spain's uneven capitalist development. The Mediterranean Levant of Spain, most of the land in the regions of Catalonia and Valencia, are rich and well-watered. Crops of wheat, olives, and grapes could be harvested 3 times a year some places. Medieval Catalonia had been a thriving merchant kingdom, and in the 19th century, the proceeds of wine and wheat exports helped provide investment capital for a textile industry. Industry requires labor, however, and due to the richness of the soil, Catalan farmers were relatively prosperous and happy to stay on their land, free of the domination of an employer. The sale of church and municipal lands didn't change their attitudes. But the situation was very different in the west and south of Catalonia, in the interior regions of Andalusia and Extremadura, which is an unforgiving landscape whose name derives from the Latin for outermost hard. It is a badass region which had an overproduced warrior caste who ended up making up a large number of the conquistadors of the New World, including Cortez and Pizarro, hard men making hard times in the New World. There, water was scarce, the land was parched, and many areas might see a successful harvest once every 3 years. Farmers were poor, margins of survival thin, and they were dependent on access to common lands for grazing. The sale of this land had an instant dramatic effect. The case of Seville is instructive. This capital of Andalusia had been coated in gold during the high water mark of Spanish imperial power, but the gold that didn't cover the city's domes and columns passed right through to Genoa to pay back the loans taken out by the king to fund fruitless wars of conquest and occupation. The countryside, meanwhile, languished. When church and municipal lands were sold and capitalist property relations were extended there, lands that had once belonged to 6,000 different families were concentrated into the ownership of only 400 families. Those dispossessed were forced to sell their labors to the new landowners, whose vast, disconnected estates were known in the Roman style as latifundia. There were vastly more free hands than work for them to do, so rural farm laborers, braceros, often went unemployed and unpaid for half of the year. They survived from their meager wages, odd jobs, and the proceeds of personal gardens. For those who refused this life of enforced idleness, there was another option: moving to Barcelona to work for wages in the budding textile industry. In this way, the land sales indirectly helped expand Catalonian industry by expanding the supply of wage laborers, and a rural and urban proletariat began forming in a swath of Spain running from the southwest to the northeast.
A la huelga, compañero, no vayas a trabajar.
The Spanish crown, through the institution of the Inquisition, had assiduously persecuted any hint of Protestantism under their domain. The Inquisition's members were appointed by the king, not the Pope, and constituted the only nationwide extension of royal authority following the completion of the Reconquista. And they were more than happy to light up a fucking heretic. But where Martin Luther had failed, Adam Smith succeeded. With the land sales, Isabella's liberals finally began the process of liquidating the wealth and social influence of the Catholic Church, which is the start of capitalism wherever it occurs in Europe. And this is what the Carlists of the North were taking up arms to prevent. From the immiserated peasants of the South, life was marked by poverty, hunger, and the arbitrary oppression of the landowning class. Their oppression was carried out by two institutions that represented landowner will: the Civil Guard, a national paramilitary police force that kept a landowner-friendly version of peace in the villages, and the other, of course, the Catholic Church, whose priests used the language of God to justify the persistence of misery. The new rural and urban proletarians broke violently against the authority of the Church. But since 300 years and a scientific and industrial revolution had intervened since the beginning of the Reformation, they didn't turn to the Bible to understand their new position in the world. They turned to Darwin, Proudhon, and Bakunin. In the stagnant villages of Andalusia and the teeming, decaying slums of Barcelona, a new understanding and vision of the world was emerging through the violent collective encounter between these feudal subjects and modern capitalism. What they understood was that the God of the Church was a lie, a fairy tale to enforce quiescence to a regime of perfect tyranny where life existed at the whim of the employer. This arrangement had been bad enough under feudalism, but there had been a relationship between people and the land that only an act of God, not man, could sever. There were mutual chains of obligation between vassal and servant. Now the church stood by while they were thrown off the land, severed from all social ties, and into permanent subjugation, and they called it God's will. According to the church, obedience to one's masters grants a reward of eternal love and happiness in heaven. And that's a heaven that rational inquiry and collective breakthroughs of modern science show are fraudulent. But the love, the sacred presence that suffused the experience of village and family life, the laughter in the face of suffering that heaven represented on earth, that had been real. It was real and could be made real again. The native puebla, the medieval village, cooperating in harmony for the good of all, absent lying priests, thieving merchants, and thuggish landlords, was the only paradise worth seeking. This imagined horizon of a perfected rural utopia is what they squinted to see when enduring the humiliations of rural idleness and suffering the physical and spiritual exhaustion of factory labor, when they compared the past of real and imagined harmony with the discordant present they found themselves in. So being largely illiterate and socially discombobulated, it took time and the intervention of motivated foreigners to give a shape to this new peasant faith. In 1868, a man named Giuseppe Fanelli appeared in the budding textile manufacturing hub of Barcelona. He was a disciple of the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who was at that time competing with Karl Marx for preeminence in the first International Working Man's Association, which was the first attempt to create a coalition of labor groups and parties across Europe and the New World. The process of traumatic dis- and reenchantment going on in Spain was going on all across Europe, and the association was an attempt to bring the national working class movements into cooperation with each other. Marx and Bakunin represented different approaches to the question of what is to be done by the men and women who were tasked with doing it. Marx, not coincidentally the son of a civil servant from the industrializing Rhineland of industrializing Germany, thought the workers would have to move through the political and social institutions developed by capitalism in order to transcend it. Bakunin, not coincidentally the son of noble landowners in Russia, which at this period was a still feudal and overwhelmingly rural country where the peasant village still stood as a model of potential social harmony, well, he saw these institutions as prisons to be avoided and fought against. The people would collectively and spontaneously transcend and displace the instruments of social oppression and create a free and independent association of producers. The trust and love of everyday village life used as brick and mortar to build up non-coercive mechanisms of production. Now, Marx's ideas spread among the former artisan class of the advanced capitalist states like England and Germany and France, who viewed encroaching capitalism as a threat, but possessed the skills and tools to bargain with capitalism from a position of relative strength, relative to these dispossessed peasants anyway. In the south of Spain, where Catholic monarchs, local elites, and the New World gold had stymied capitalist development, and the new proletariat was forced into an abject relationship to capital, Bakunin's message found greater purchase. And Bakunin's disciple, Fanelli, who spoke no Spanish, gave French language lectures in Barcelona, and there found a ready audience for his message. Now, the first people to hear this message were the alienated and literate of the city, school teachers, students, and printers. And soon the message spread to the factory floor. Traveling prophets of what would eventually be known as the idea went from village to village like medieval friars. They told the people that the simple village contentment that wove a thread through generational memories of rural life could be the model for a whole new way of being. The state, the church, the owners, the civil guard were only obstacles to the realization of heaven on earth. These secular saints added to their message the propaganda of their own personal decency. They generally abstained from alcohol, meat, and any kind of carnality. They lived simply and generously. Now, compared to the often illiterate, often indolent, usually drunk parish priest, the sadistic civil guards, the corrupt paper-pushing bureaucrats of the state, and the vampiric bosses, these anarchist evangelists gained a social legitimacy deeper than symbols can convey. In 1872, anarchist laborers in the dry village of Alcroy then marched through the streets, parading the severed heads of the mayor and civil guard in front of them. The Spanish Reformation had its Anabaptists and its long, slow-motion peasant war. By 1873, there were 50,000 self-described Bakuninists in Spain, most of them in Catalonia. And these would form the nucleus of a movement that would come to dominate the cities and villages of both Catalonia and Andalusia. The apocalyptic anarchist horizon was best articulated by the theorist and physician Dr. Isaac Puente, whose writings would be hugely influential in the syndicalist trade movement of the 20s and 30s. Quote, "There is no need to invent anything or to create a new organization. The nuclei of the organization around which the future economic life will be organized already exist in the present society, the trade union and the free municipality. Rather than the liberal state, it was the rural municipality of ancient origin which offered a way to, quote, the solution of all the problems of coexistence in the countryside." But elsewhere in Spain, the advent of liberal modernity and the fitful course of capitalist development brought different social forms into being. West of Andalusia, in the center of Spain, the core of the old Spanish monarchy were the provinces of Aragon and Castile, Madrid being Castile's capital and the capital of Spain. In the Middle Ages, the declining fertility of that already arid region led the feudal lords of Old Castile to enclose their land and introduce sheep herds for wool export, which is pretty much what what had happened in England around the exact same time, but lacking the same structures to push that process forward. All that happened in Spain was that in the short term, they boosted the riches of the landowners, drove the peasants off the land, and for the most part into the army or across the Atlantic to try their luck in the New World, but without a centralizing governing structure capable of directing those wolf profits into the rationalization of agriculture and industrial production. The sheep grazed the land dry within a few hundred years, and Castile was left parched and agriculturally unproductive. But thanks to this vent of emigration and military service absorbing the dispossessed, Castile maintained a class of roughly subsistent, poor, but crucially independent peasantry. Because they held the titles to their land, they still spiritually adhered to the Catholic Church and the idea of Spain in a way that the landless peasantry of Andalusia could not. For these peasants, crown and cross were the protectors of sacred rights, not the inflictors of their misery. Extremadura to the west was roughly similar, the trials of subsistence harder because the soil was even poorer. To the northwest, along the Atlantic coast, was the sandy, infertile region of Galicia, the last remnant of Celtic Spain, where, as in the center of the country, subsistence peasantry dominated. It was only to the east of Galicia, along the northern Atlantic coast, that Spain possessed the sufficient mineral resources to fuel any kind of industrial development. So while wine and wheat build a textile industry in Barcelona, the coal and iron of Asturias and the Basque Country built a steel and shipbuilding industry in Bilbao, the capital of the Basque province of Biscay. And so it was the Basques, a distinct ethno-religious group with their own language, which is an isolate with no known connection to any Indo-European language, became the vector for capitalist development in Iberia. So as capitalism grew in Bilbao, it created a middle bourgeois population that filled the gap left by the religious verities of feudalism with the civic destiny of nationalism. Naturally, in a kingdom that had failed to develop a strong central administration capable of breaking down linguistic and cultural barriers, this nationalism adhered to the concept of Basqueness rather than Spanishness. The Basque region had the only big bourgeois outside of Madrid, and their industrial riches funded the creation of Spain's most powerful banking fortunes, arranged in the Dutch and English style as joint stock companies. The textile firms of Catalonia, meanwhile, were all mid-sized family firms. That means that while Catalan nationalism inspired the entire rank of the Catalan bourgeois from the big to the small, Basque nationalism was confined to the smaller bourgeois and the prosperous peasants, with bankers who did business all across Spain hostile to it. Now, farther from the coast, in the Pyrenees, was the rogue Basque province of Navarre that we talked about, another medieval kingdom as Catalonia had been, filled with hardy but prosperous peasants, fiercely protective of their rights and the God who consecrated those rights. They'd formed the backbone of the Carlist armies who rebelled against liberal Spain in the 1830s. Fittingly, the part of Spain that produced the first real industrial capitalist economy in Spain also produced the first organized reactionary resistance to it. Now, migrants drawn to the industrial centers of the Basque region formed the first proletarian political forms in Spain. Along with the skilled carpenters of Madrid, where the building trade was the closest thing to industry, they were the most receptive audience for the Marxist conception of working-class organization that arrived on the peninsula a few years after Bakunin had. For skilled and semi-skilled workers able to extract from their employers wages above mere subsistence, the path of dialectical engagement with capitalism made intuitive sense. These people were the descendants of the artisan class as opposed to the landless peasantry, and were able to engage in labor that gave them bargaining power against their bosses. So the Marxist notion of working through institutions to overcome them made sense because they had an experience of utilizing that process. So by the 1880s, in the face of government repression, there was a national trade union, the socialist one, the UGT, and a socialist party, which had a kind of a dual party membership. If you were in one, you were assumed to be in the other. Now, the driving force behind the creation of both of these institutions was a skilled printer from Galicia named Pablo Iglesias. And it's interesting to note that the first ranks of socialist and anarchist organizers is filled with printers, whose literacy gave them access to political ideas outside of the constraints of the hothouse of Spanish society, and gave them the ability to transmit those ideas to fellow workers. Now, throughout the 19th century, the liberals in Spanish government and the military had tried to push through institutional reform with an incredibly narrow social base. They had the urban bourgeois, but not the Basques or the Catalans, who were hostile to the centralizing impulse of the liberal government, and they had the leadership of the military. But the rural bourgeois saw liberalism as another invasion of godless Frenchiness, and the largely illiterate poor were unaware of and apathetic towards the machinations of a government that never seemed to impact the eternal conditions of their lives. And so liberalism stood on the bayonets of the army. This led to a pattern of cyclical political stalemate, punctuated by military coup, the result of a government lacking capacity and legitimacy to resolve conflicts. All the while, the Spanish countryside continued to languish, while uneven capitalist development caused convulsive social change in the urban areas. The coup go-around of Pronunciamentos eventually claimed Queen Isabella, who was removed from the throne in 1868. Years of instability followed, and that included the short-lived First Spanish Republic and another Carlist war sparked by another military rising in Navarre. Eventually, a rough form of governing consensus was codified in the Constitution of 1876. It would be a constitutional monarchy under crowned head of Isabella's son, Alfonso XII, and it would have universal manhood suffrage, and it would have a constituent assembly named after the medieval Cortes. So the animating mind behind the Constitution of 1876, and the guy who most embodies the struggle to resolve the contradictions involved in modernizing Spain, was a conservative politician named Antonio Cánovas de Castillo. So while Castillo, he's not a liberal really, because he is hostile to the overall liberal project, but he recognizes that liberals could be reconciled to a conservative monarchical regime if they were allowed access to the perks and privileges of political power. And Castillo, to that end, engineered a system known as the Turno Pacifico, or the peaceful shift, and it would define Spanish politics until well into the 20th century. And it was a coordinated and orderly cyclical transfer of power between Castillo's conservative party and the liberal party of a guy named Prajedes Mateo Sagasta. And this system was designed chiefly to divide political patronage in a peaceful fashion. And even though the 1876 Constitution codified universal manhood suffrage, the mass of the poor in rural Spain were apathetic, if not hostile, to politics. And their involvement was managed in the countryside by those local bosses, the caciques. And their methods were known as caciquismo. Caciquismo! So caciques used brute squads, which were nicknamed the Party of the Bludgeon, to wrangle votes on election day, and they negotiated amongst themselves to divide political offices and spoils, and they also acted as intermediaries between their constituents and the Byzantine governing bureaucracy that was feudally attempting to extend the modern French method of central administration to a country that was still steeped in feudal social relations. So they served a purpose for everybody. They were the middlemen of a political system that had not yet reached the grassroots. Turno Pacifico and Caciquismo succeeded at blunting the liberal-conservative conflict and ending the era of pronunciamentos. There was now more struggle between the factions within a political parties than between the parties themselves. Sometimes election results would be printed in newspapers the day before the vote. The parties maintained a vague ideological difference, with the conservatives defending the church and the landowners, and liberals seeking to empower the urban bourgeois and promote secularism. But they were also largely content to swap power and patronage on the top of a still deeply rooted system of rule that had not much changed since the Reconquest. So Turnismo solved the problem of peacefully transferring power in this low legitimacy social context, but it did nothing to resolve the burgeoning class conflict in the cities and countryside, the rising sectionalism in Catalonia and the Basque region, or the persistent crisis in the rural economy. The power of regionalism and the weakness of the center meant that the government was unable to impose free trade as a stimulant to rural and industrial development, as it did in other Western countries. Instead, the regional powers, through their network of political operatives, pursued policies of maximum protection for their specific segment of the economy. So everybody is using their regional power to pursue their regional interests to protect their spot in the hierarchy, which means there can be no creative destruction in the Schubertian sense. Instead, there's universal protectionism. Every industry gets protected. There's a tariff for everybody. And that guarded incumbent producers and failed to juice consumer demand. Without colonies and unable to raise taxes from an uncooperative landowning class, the state was at the mercy of foreign banks. As the turn of the 20th century approached, the Spanish economy resembled the economy of one of its former colonies in South America, an exporter of commodities to the West with a meager domestic market. French capital had built the railroads in Spain, and British capital had helped build the mining operations in the north. And there, the British mine engineers would swan around in pith helmets. You might think that they were in Kenya or in India.
Retumban los cañones sobre las llamas. ¿Qué será? Ay, ¿qué pasará? ¿Qué estará pasando? La Marina Española que está luchando.
The sharp decline in Spain's power was brought into stark relief by the Spanish-American War of 1898. The awakening American giant snatched Spain's remaining colonial possessions away with shocking ease. And this was after the Spanish had spent a fruitless decade in blood and treasure struggling to repress local independence movements in the Philippines and Cuba. They essentially loosened the jar for America to just come in and pop it right open. It turns out that a military that's built mostly around kicking one group of lawyers out of a room and replacing them with another isn't always the best to fight a stand-up war. It was an army filled with bristling, stiff-necked officers of aristocratic and bourgeois background, leading ill-equipped, ill-fed peasant conscripts. Many officers in the top-heavy army pilfered material and provisions for sale on the black market. The disaster, as the Spanish-American War was known, caused some soul-searching among Spain's intellectual and political class, but, once again, the lack of a dynamic center to Spanish life prevented any of these energies from translating into reform. Instead, the Catalan ruling class became more agitated than ever to unshackle themselves from the corpse of Castile. They were being held back by all these lazy peasants in the countryside. Spain, at the turn of the century, was a country stuck between worlds. But at the level of the local village, life was a single world of outlandish poverty and obscene opulence. 2/3 of the population still lived on the land. Life expectancy was as it had been in the year 1500. With a stagnant economy, the last colonial holdings gone, with the regional bourgeois and working class agitating for power, Castillo's Turno system began to crack. The man himself was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in 1897. Assassinations, bombings, fitful strike action, these are the first expressions of cohering working class offensive capacity. And since it's still relatively nascent, a lot of it comes out in acts of individual, spectacular violence. So many politicians got clapped at the opera. You show up at the opera, there's a 20% chance some dude stabs you with a penknife before the ovation. For King Alfonso and the old aristocrats, for whom imperial conquests were fundamental to their conception of what Spain was, the disaster of 1898 was a profound humiliation. But luckily for them, a new opportunity to enjoy vicarious glory soon arose. French expansion in Morocco had forced Spain to secure control of the North African territory directly across from the mainland. And in 1904, Spain and France officially partitioned Morocco into zones of control, with Spain occupying the territory directly across from the Iberian Peninsula. Once again, countries are pushed into destabilizing action by the actions of their competitors. There was no capacity for Spain to occupy Morocco, but if France was going to occupy Morocco, they had to occupy the part of Morocco across from Spain, or else they would be flanked by a potential enemy. And so they committed to a spectacularly ill-advised, bloody, and protracted conflict in Morocco. But the military, defiantly unreformed after 1898, was soon predictably overwhelmed by the task set to them. But the commitment there was deepened by the fact that pretty soon they set up lucrative mining operations as well. So now sunk cost fallacy sinks in, and there's nothing to do but pour more and more resources in there. And by 1909, there are 40,000 Spanish troops in Morocco. In late July of that year, the conservative Prime Minister Antonio Maras called up a mixed brigade of active and reserve soldiers in Barcelona to deploy to put down rebellious tribes. Now, the prospect of colonial service distressed reservists who would be pulled from their jobs that supported their families. And this action appalled the rabidly anti-militarist anarchist workers of Barcelona, because one of the chief ideological tenets of anarchism is anti-militarism, disgust with the structures of military life, which were offensive to human dignity and independence. And they expressed themselves in a trade union called Solidaridad Obrera, which was inspired by the syndicalist movement in, of course, France, which is always going to serve as the prod for action in Spain. And they sought to turn the organ of the trade union itself, not the state, not political parties within the state or any state institutions, the trade union, into the social machine that would overthrow and replace capitalism. And in an echo of the liberal Cadiz mutiny of 1820, Solidaridad Obrera allied with socialists in the city to declare a general strike to resist the call-up. And what followed after the declaration of the strike was 7 days of riots, church burning, and religious grave desecration that would be remembered as the Tragic Week. Eventually, troops from outside Catalonia were brought in who could be relied on to fire on the crowds, and a blood-soaked order was restored. Over 100 civilians were killed, and 5 people were executed for incitement. One of those killed was Francisco Ferrer, the founder of the modern school movement, which sought to introduce rational inquiry to the poor, priest-haunted children of the urban proletariat. This violent event left deep impressions everywhere. The police crackdown became a scandal that brought down Marat's government. The anarchist experience helped move some of them to create the National Confederation of Labor, the CNT, an anarcho-syndicalist union that sought to organize people by craft within industries and organize from the bottom up, with authority vested in the factory sections themselves and federated outward, rather than administered downward from a central committee as the socialist trade unions were. For the conservatives, what lingered of the Tragic Week were the grisly tales of churches burned and holy grave sites desecrated, laughing young girls dancing with the disinterred corpses of nuns. It was very metal. It was a very metal week. It would be a good name for a album or a band.
Viva la paz y la CNT, luchemos hermanos contra los tiranos y los requetés. Rojo pendón, negro color, luchemos hermanos aunque en la batalla debamos morir. Los tiempos de Rivera.
In the aftermath of the Tragic Week, Spain got its most energetic liberal government since the fall of Queen Isabella. Prime Minister José Canalejas attempted to reduce the power of the rural caciques and took on the power of the church by limiting the growth of religious orders. And for his trouble, Canalejas was assassinated by an anarchist in 1912. The short-lived Canalejas experiment did have one lasting result. It provided a basis for cooperation between the liberal bourgeois parties and the socialists. Both groups fought to modernize the Spanish economy, either to fulfill the promise of capitalism or transcend it, but the class conflict inherent in that process was always going to push them apart. The thing that brought them together was that they both agreed on the need to break the social power of the large landowners and their social instrument, the church. For liberals, the church held Spain back. For socialists, it held Spain down. Either way, Spanish working class and urban bourgeois ambitions both depended on the church's role in culture to be drastically reduced. Rational inquiry was an effect of liberalism that even socialists and anarchists found useful and thought would liberate the youth of the nation and allow them to ascend new social heights. As the liberals and the left came closer over the religious issue, the right began to view both groups as different elements of a larger corrosive force destroying the country, a social contagion they referred to as anti-Spain. You guys are literally the opposite of Spain. For the Carlists of Navarre, the rural latifundists of the South, and their sons in the military officer corps, and the monarchist press, Spain, the Spain of conquest and Catholicism, was a pure and eternal thing. The endemic social unrest of the era was the product, clearly, of malign foreign influences seeking to undermine and destroy eternal Spain. The daily ceaseless pain of the poor could be heard only faintly at these heights, and thus could not be fully accounted for. What's the cause of this? Everything's great. It must be some other spirit that we must conjure. And of course, Jews, as always, figure in this theory, as they always do. But since most of the Jews had been driven out of Spain centuries before, there would have to be other more near boogeymen to be summoned. And a good one were the Freemasons. The Freemasons were mostly urban bourgeois people who were organized together to network socially and economically, and to promote the sort of secular cosmopolitan liberalism that the right associated with the godless French Republic. Freemasonry was a way to secularly meet if you were part of the generation who had been disenchanted from the church and was being reenchanted into capitalism. And the Freemasons were a ritualistic gateway between those two worlds. And as a result, the right figures that they were secretly, because they meet in secret, controlling and directing anti-Spain towards the annihilation of Spain. And according to the right, the class violence of the anarchist workers was the result of a loss of faith that would not be ended by a changing of their conditions, but by re-Catholicizing the working class through state-enforced education and a paternalist moral reform movement. These benighted people needed to learn to love their God and their nation again. And that meant the ceaseless agitation of the secular cosmopolitan liberals had to be restrained. Shut the fuck up. You're scaring the hose. Stop talking about how God isn't real. You're freaking out these poor people. They're going to kill everybody. Unburdened by colonies, and therefore out of the European great power sweepstakes, Spain avoided the entanglements of alliances that brought the continent to general war in 1914. Interestingly, if you've ever wondered why the 1918 flu is called the Spanish flu, it's not because it started in Spain. It probably started on an army base in Kansas. It's called the Spanish flu because Spain, being the lone non-belligerent of the major countries of Europe, was the only country to not have wartime press censorship, and so was the first country to report cases of the flu, where otherwise it was being censored. So that was one result of neutrality. Another result of neutrality was a huge boom to the Spanish economy. Fortunes were made and thousands were hired to provide ships, textiles, coal, and iron to the warring parties. Declining imports from the rest of Europe forced the government to fund domestic import substitution. Migrants from poor rural districts like Murcia and Almeria flooded into Barcelona. Millions of people accustomed until extremely recently to the languid pace and intense communal ties of the country village were introduced to the rapidity and alienation of urban living overnight. Employment boomed, but inflation cut into workers' wages. Mass culture reached them in the form of movie theaters that spread across Spain like flickering mushrooms and generated new forms of subjectivity. Infant mortality dropped, fueling a massive baby boom. So while Spain avoided fighting in World War I, though, it could only postpone the bloody social reckoning the rest of the country underwent. It could not avoid it. The social ferment that the war represented elsewhere was still happening in Spain. The rising expectations and population of the poor, the development of a mass political consciousness fueled by the war economy, the creation of new horizons of state and technological capacity, all of those could only be socially processed violently in the absence of legitimate institutions. The violence began even before the Great War had ended. By 1917, three groups were independently pissed off at the conservative government. Junior army officers were angry at low pay and irregular promotions. The Catalan nationalists were seeking autonomy, and both the socialist UGT and the anarchist CNT had their ranks swollen with new members in the wartime boom and were seeking to test their new strength. With the officers and the Catalans in an uproar, the UGT and CNT attempted to stage a general strike, the fulfillment of the syndicalist promise of revolutionary unionism. But working class institutions at this point were no more functional than any other institutions in Spain, and when those junior officers predictably turned their guns on the workers, it was only a matter of time until the strikes were broken. In Madrid, the arrest of the strike leaders ended things. In Barcelona, it took a week of street fighting. The longest holdouts were the striking miners of Asturias in the north, who were only eventually defeated with ungloved repression. News of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia hit Spain like lightning, sending electricity pulsating through the social grassroots. A bell had sounded. Somewhere, a mass of toiling workers and peasants had overthrown an oppressive monarchy, aristocracy, and church. It was possible. Redemption was at hand. in the Andalusian countryside, the years 1918 to 1920 became known as the Bolshevik Triennium, with waves of land seizures, braceros on strike, and battles with landowners and their civil guard lackeys. In Barcelona, a class war defined by strikes and lockouts spilled out into a running gun battle between anarchist militants and thugs hired by the Catalan Employers Federation. This time, which would later be called Pistolerismo, or pistol rule, saw over 800 deadly attacks on union organizers, employers, and police. The state came down hard on the CNT, jailing those of their leadership who were not shot down in the street. This decapitation of the movement left the initiative with the CNT membership, who were literally hungrier and more radical in their demands and vision. One of the things that shaped Spanish anarchism was the Employer Federation's refusal to make any accommodations to the workers, with the weak central government backing their intransigence. With no hope of carrots, the Barcelona worker felt from the state and modernity as a whole only sticks. In Madrid, 15 government ministries rose and fell between 1917 and 1921. Terrorismo had broken against the rocks of regional and class-based revolt, but no political formation could assert itself amidst the ruins. The manifest incompetence of the state extended to its last colonial outpost as well. In 1921, a buffoonish general bungled his way into a series of ambushes by Moroccan insurgents who killed 15,000 Spanish conscripts and led thousands of captive officers away in chains. At this point, conservatives, liberals, and workers were aligned on one thing. The constitutional monarchy initiated in 1876 was a failed experiment. Enter General Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Captain General of the Army in Catalonia, who revived the Spanish tradition of Pronunciamento in September of 1923. Primo de Rivera was from an aristocratic Andalusian landowning family, a veteran of the Moroccan counterinsurgency, and the military commander of the army in Catalonia. His proposition to the king, Cortes, elites, and the people of Spain was simple. It was time for this earnest political amateur to make right what generations of cynical professionals had made wrong. Unfortunately for Spain, he wasn't bullshitting. He actually was a earnest political amateur, not just pretending to be one, and he governed accordingly. Though King Alfonso once introduced him to King Victor Emmanuel of Italy as my Mussolini, Primo had neither the vision nor social base to achieve anything like fascism. His half-hearted attempt to build an official state political movement, the Patriotic Union, fizzled. His solution to Spain's problems were simple, if only fitfully effective. He extended the police crackdown on the CNT in Barcelona to the whole country until the organization was forced underground entirely. Meanwhile, though, he co-opted the more reformist socialist UGT by bringing its leader, Largo Caballero, into government and hiring socialist union officials to mediate disputes between employers and workers. But Primo could do nothing about the stagnance of Spanish agriculture or challenge the power of the rural bosses. For a while, this was masked by an economic boom that raised all boats in the early 20s, as well as a few successful government investments. Primo began a massive program of government infrastructure spending that put people to work and created a modern hydroelectric grid. He also oversaw the final victory over the Moroccan insurgents in the Rif War in 1925. But these triumphs are less impressive upon closer inspection. Unable to confront elites and raise taxes, the infrastructure projects were financed with foreign loans that fatally tipped the Spanish balance sheet. The defeat of the Rif tribesmen was only made possible by the timely intervention of the French, because the rebels had overextended themselves and attacked French territory. Economic rationalization meant handing over government export monopolies to friends and cronies like Juan March, who collaborated with Primo to turn what was a tobacco smuggling operation into a legal tobacco monopoly. Primo's was essentially a vibes-based dictatorship, and one who lives by the vibe dies by it. By 1930, the Great Depression had crippled the economy. The value of the Spanish currency, the peseta, had dropped 50% over the course of the decade. Primo had antagonized liberal and student opinion by arbitrarily intervening in the legal system, though they hadn't been bothered too much by breaking the CNT. Primo also antagonized the army by intervening in a dispute about the artillery division's promotion schedule. Seems meaningless, but when Primo asked his generals for a vibe check for his status within the army, he failed. They told him that they would not support him, and so Primo went to exile in Paris, where he promptly died, leaving Spain in need of a new governing institution.
Los cielos de España llenas once de alas que luchan audaces por su redención. Esas alas rojas la vanguardia son del antifascismo que ahogará sin compasión a la bestia negra de la reacción.
The years of dictatorship had only succeeded in deepening the fault lines in Spanish society. The CNT had been effectively outlawed, but in 1927, a collection of so-called affinity groups within the anarchist movement founded a vanguard activist organization called the Iberian Anarchist Federation, or FAI. This group didn't seek to lead the masses to revolution as the Bolsheviks had, but rather to prevent the bureaucratic structures of the CNT Union from stifling the revolutionary energies of the anarchist masses. In practice, what that meant was orchestrating local conflicts with authorities, with the goal of provoking spontaneous uprisings that would eventually catch into general flames of rebellion. Meanwhile, opinion among respectable liberals and even military leaders was that the monarchy, which had indulged Primo, had outlived its usefulness. The same year, Primo de Rivera went into exile, an abortive Republican military coup illustrated how tenuous Alfonso XIII, by this point, hold on the throne was. By early 1931, liberal and student agitation drove Alfonso out of the country, and the Second Spanish Republic was soon born. Managed democracy and benign dictatorship had failed to develop Spain or soothe its social conflicts. While long-standing democracies in the rest of Europe struggled to sustain legitimacy in the face of the Depression, Spain would try to build a legitimate mass democratic government from scratch. Good luck. Dubbed the Republic of Professors for the cast of its leadership, otherwise known as the Revenge of the Nerds, the Second Spanish Republic began as an alliance of liberal Republican parties based in the urban professional classes, with the two leading figures of the Socialist Party, Largo Caballero and Indelico Prieto, both of them given ministries in the government at labor and finance respectively. The shared mandate of every element of the new regime was to break the power of the church, the landowners, and the army over Spanish life, while preventing the inherent violence of the process from overwhelming the political system. And then, as soon as they began, the churches burned. The government's response to the church burning wave of May 1931 was considered by everyone who was already skeptical of the new regime to be criminally late and half-hearted. For the Catholic right, the Republic would always bear the stain of the anti-clerical riots. So, from the Republic's first day, the stakes are set at apocalyptic. The landowners, both large and small, saw the Republic as the Antichrist, set upon dethroning God and revoking their titles of ownership. Such a fate could only be conceived of as a descent into hell, especially given decades' worth of breathless, titillated stories in the respectable bourgeois press about Bolshevik Russia, where God and deed had been abolished and blood-soaked poverty now reigned. The anarchists, who opposed the Republic, but whose organizing and agitating was allowed by it, as well as the most embittered socialists, as well as the small and growing national and regional communist parties, all spoke for those who had experienced being God's favored nation as dispossession of land, fundamentally agreed with what the right was saying. They were out to depose God and redistribute the land. But for them, it was not hell being created on earth, but heaven, in the form of the socialist project, which had materialized Christianity after the Enlightenment. The collective secular struggle for equality and justice could only be conceived as the highest form of life, especially given the decades' worth of breathless, titillated stories in the respectable working-class press about Bolshevik Russia, where communism had been declared and the holy work of building the workers' state gloriously continued. The attendant violence was deemed tragically necessary by the Marxists, a betrayal of freedom by the anarchists, but all agreed that Russia was the first battleground in a global class war that would soon come to their doorsteps. The liberals, the bourgeois Catalan and Basque nationalists, academics, journalists, lawyers, professionals, who represented those who tended to have no particular emotional relationship to the land, one way or the other, who instead tended to work with symbols, insisted that this whole framework was hysterical nonsense. The Republic didn't stand for anything like that. Yes, the power of the church needed to be curbed, but only to allow for enlightened modern education to transform illiterate peasants into productive workers. Don't you want productive workers? They could contribute their intellect to their employer's bottom line. Everybody wins. They could boost Spain into the ranks of developed nations, where the spoils of development could be distributed, if not equally, then rationally. Yes, the land would have to be redistributed, capital investment in mechanization would have to be compelled, but that was only to advance the greater goal of a developed modern Spain. For the liberals, comfortably adjacent to the mutually reinforcing agonies of master and servant, the value of sacrificing immediate interest for the greater project of creating modern Spain was self-evident. But for those who struggled every day to ignore the rising protest of their stricken conscience on the one hand, or their rumbling stomachs on the other, a sterile talking house Spain, where real conflict was diffused into wind, was a dire prospect, even if it wasn't delusional. Trading dignity for safety until both had disappeared was a fate worse than death. Much better to suffer exquisite extinguishment in the existential combat, which promised an end to suffering just as certainly as victory did. Now, the plummy British academics who dominate the English language historiography of the Spanish Civil War have a very hard time hiding their sympathies for the liberals, who they clearly see as the lone sane faction during this period, trying heroically to steer a nation of gibbering reactionaries and unhinged radicals towards the shores of modern democratic capitalism. In this view, stated or unstated, modern democratic capitalism is simply the process of a nation coming to its senses. Now, from the placid shores of England, that logic is unimpeachable. There, the bloody work of imbuing deliberative governing structures with popular legitimacy had occurred at the head of the serpent of European capitalist development, not the tail. In England, the even bloodier work of building and maintaining a global system of commodity exchange, sufficient to buy off the keenest edge of landowner guilt and proletarian hunger, allowed real political conflict to express itself in colonial massacres and famines, nothing in the heartland. You get to have your precious parliament and have your votes in the metropole. But Spain had no colonies, had lost her colonies. Her commodity exchange network was paltry. The brutal class war spurred by fear and hunger raged inside of her, not in far-off colonies. With economic depression racking the land and no internal system able to reform Spain's political economy from within, time would show which faction of Spanish politics was actually detached from reality. On a hot night in July, the 18th, 1936, anarchist dock workers boarded the prison ship Uruguay while it sat in the port of Barcelona. The prisons were the singularly most repulsive institution to the anarchist spirit. Anarchist adventurists like Buenaventura Durruti and Francisco Escaco had repeatedly attacked the Uruguay with bombs and bullets over the years. But this night was not a raid or a jailbreak. The CNT activists were on the Uruguay to liberate not the prisoners, but the guards' weapons. Because in Spanish Morocco, the army had seized control and declared its intention to overthrow the Republic. There were rumors that Seville had been taken as well, and that the garrisons of Madrid and Barcelona would rise in the morning. If they were to avoid destruction, the CNT workers of the city needed all the guns they could get their hands on. The news had filtered into Barcelona throughout the 18th of July. Confused radio announcements, newspaper articles, telephone calls from relations elsewhere in the country. Spanish Morocco had fallen first, and now civil guard and armed right-wing civilians on the mainland were joining forces with military units to arrest representatives of the left-wing Popular Front government and union leaders. For the moment, however, the various army barracks of Barcelona were silent, but throbbing with quiet menace. Luis Companys, the president of the Generalitat, the annoyingly named Catalonian autonomous regional government. I know it was what you called yourself in the Middle Ages, but it sounds annoying to say. Just call it the General something. I don't care. The General House, the Generalitat. I'm sick of it. President of the Generalitat was a good liberal lawyer who had defended anarchists pro bono during the years of pistol rule that followed World War I. But now, faced with the prospect of arming the CNT to distributing weapons to the workers of the city to put down a rebellion, he balked. The only thing scarier to the bourgeois leaders of the Catalan government than the prospect of a military coup was the prospect of an anarchist revolution. So the CNT used their radio station to announce a general strike to begin the next day, and CNT defense committees set out that night to take destiny and weapons into their own hands. Military armories guarded either lightly or by sympathetic enlisted men were raided. The jailers on the Uruguay were relieved of their arsenal. Gun shops were stripped bare. A shipment of dynamite laying in a docked freighter was expropriated and turned into makeshift hand grenades. Welders fused metal sheeting to the side of trucks and taxicabs to create makeshift armored cars. Across the city, paving stones, rolls of newsprint, and sandbags were stacked into makeshift barricades. The sleepless textile workers, printers, barbers, students, and school teachers of Barcelona tensed for sunrise. The fate of the city, the country, the human race would be decided in the morning. Cataclysms like the Spanish Civil War send shockwaves through time, both forward and backward. The declaration of the Second Spanish Republic in 1931 had established civil war as an existential inevitability. An underdeveloped agricultural economy in the middle of a global depression was not going to be turned into a modern capitalist state through points of parliamentary procedure. No European country that lacked significant colonies made the transition to modernity peacefully, and Spain would not be an exception. For 5 years, the people of Spain, latifundists to braceros, magnates to mechanics, were subtly but forcefully aligned towards open civil conflict, like iron filings drawn into battle order by the great magnetic spike of war lodged in their collective future. The riots and church burnings that had accompanied the establishment of the Second Republic in May of 1931 were a dark omen, but the liberals and reformist socialists of the new government set about undaunted to the task of rewriting the Spanish Constitution. Their agenda was bold. The land, the army, and the church would each be transformed, and with them, Spain. The church was their first target, looming large as it did over Spanish life, relatively inexpensive to tackle, and uniting the otherwise quarrelsome liberal Republicans and Marxist socialists in their mutual resentment of the institution. So, Articles 26 and 27 of the new Republican Constitution ended Catholic influence over Spanish education and public spaces. The Jesuits were banned, by the way, not for the first time in the history of Spain. Charles III had also banned their asses in the 18th century. They are always annoying to everyone. That's the Jesuits. The state stipend for clergy, which had existed for 100 years, was sunset. Now, this was significant in a country with well over 100,000 priests, nuns, and monks running around. Those funds would be shifted to build thousands of secular schools and raise pay for secular school teachers. This is the culture war erupting into modernizing Spain. For the right, these reforms were nothing less than the repetition of Christ's crucifixion. Coming as they did after the state's desultory response to the church burnings in May, the church reforms marked the Republic as fundamentally antagonistic to traditional Spanish religious life. Anti-Spain in power. In July, two top Spanish prelates, a cardinal and a bishop, who walked into a bar and then had persisted in condemning the government and extolling the fallen monarchy, were exiled to France. And in Navarre, the smallholding peasants whose ancestors had fought and lost multiple wars against liberalism on behalf of the Carlist pretender to the throne and the Catholic Church, unearthed their grandfathers' red berets, which were the symbols of the movement, and began to stir again into political action.
Por Dios, por la patria y el rey, lucharon nuestros padres. Por Dios, por la patria y el rey, lucharemos nosotros también.
Meanwhile, War Minister Manuel Azana set about the task of cleaning the Augean stables of the Spanish military. The army was bloated and top-heavy, with one officer for every 11 soldiers and a general for every 1,200. often a make-work program for the non-inheriting sons of the rural landowning class. Military expenditures made up 18% of the Spanish budget, but 60% of that went to officers' salaries, leaving the army itself chronically under-equipped. War Minister Azana went about slashing the officer corps by offering full pensions to all who chose to retire and demanding all who remained in active service to swear an oath of loyalty to the Republic. Over 5,000 officers took the buyout. Azana also reduced the number of army divisions on the peninsula and abolished 3 military academies, including one in Zaragoza under the direction of a Brigadier General Francisco Franco, who might come in later to the story. Military judicial authority was curtailed, and to balance out the civil guard, which was seen as a tool of the rural landowners who were most hostile to the Republic, the government established a new paramilitary police force, the Assault Guard. The cuddly named Assault Guard would be concentrated in cities rather than in the countryside, and ideally be staffed by officers more loyal to the Republic. These reforms succeeded in shrinking the army, but didn't make it any more institutionally loyal to the Republic. Many liberal officers took the pensions to get out of a stubbornly reactionary institution that resisted meaningful reform. The right-wing officers who took pensions retired to complain and scheme against the Republic. Those who remained complained and schemed on the clock. For the officer corps, the army was Spain, and Azana's reforms compromised the army's authority and autonomy. It didn't help that Azana, who is a career journalist and man of letters, spoke of pulverizing the army. And this was after he had excused the government's slow response to the church burnings in May by saying that all the churches in Spain weren't worth a single Republican life. These gaffes didn't prevent Azana from becoming prime minister, though, when the new Republican Constitution was ratified in October. And for all the Sturm und Drang that accompanied church and army reform, it was agrarian form that would decide the fate of the Republic. Its first fruits were laws that restricted rural evictions and banned landowners from hiring laborers from outside of their municipality. This was to prevent the importation of cheaper migrant labor and increase the negotiating power of the local braceros. Now, the owners howled at this infringement of their sacred rights of property and contract, and they argued that it forced them to hire incompetent locals over skilled outsiders. But the measure's effect on rural poverty was dramatic and instantaneous. Wages for farm laborers doubled between 1931 and 1933, propelling a massive influx of peasants into the Socialist Party and the agricultural section of the UGT Socialist Union. The farm laborers tended to prefer anarchism, but the rapid wage increases and eviction protections were the first taste of meaningful political reform in their lifetimes. Suddenly, politics felt like a place that they could be represented. Soon, there were 500,000 braceros in the Socialist UGT Union, bringing with them the deep hunger, pain, and resentment of poor rural existence, which had until then had mostly found an outlet in the anarchist C&T trade unions.
A la huelga, compañero, no vayas a trabajar. Deja quieta la herramienta, que es la hora de luchar. A la huelga,
Now, for all their immediate effect, these reforms were still only ameliorative measures. Real agrarian reform would require redistribution, rationalization, and reinvestment. The good old 3 R's. We love them. It was this question, as well as the question of Catalan autonomy, that dominated the deliberations of the Cortes in the first half of 1932. Because, as I said, Catalan politics at this point are dominated by a left bourgeois party, an alliance of peasants and the middle class in the cities. And they were a hugely important part of the overall Republican coalition. And so making them happy was key to the long-term success of the Republic. So like everything else in Spain, the Catalan bourgeois was divided. They all supported autonomy, but the large textile owners, small compared to the Basque industrialists and financiers, were otherwise as staunchly Catholic and reactionary as the Castilian-speaking right. But as I said, by 1932, Catalan politics was dominated by the Esquerra, which is Catalan for left party. And that's small bourgeois, the small-holding dead vine peasants who own their land, but only at the sufferance of a medieval right to harvest near the dead vines of larger estates. And it was their constant conflict with the large landowners that sharpened their politics to the left. And it also got votes from a lot of non-anarchist workers in Barcelona, as well as the anarchist workers who did vote, even though the CNT said don't do that. A lot of them still did. And when they did, they voted for the Esquerra. And now the Esquerra wanted their demands met, which is Catalan autonomy, their own ability to make local laws and spend local revenues. Now, to the right, specifically the officer corps of the army, who had spent years fighting a domestic counterinsurgency in the streets of Barcelona, and, by the way, whose budgets were partially dependent on Catalan tax revenues that were going to be lost with autonomy, for them, any such devolution of power was a grievous insult and another rent in the fabric of eternal Spain. All of this and more were too much for General José Sanjurjo, the commander of the Civil Guard. Now, Sanjurjo was from Navarre. He was the son of a Carlist general who had fought in the rebellion against the First Republic in the 1870s, before he was, of course, absorbed into the victorious military like the rest of the Carlist officer class. Now, Sanjurjo made an impressive career carrying out imperial and domestic counter-guerrilla warfare. He fought against rebels in Cuba before the Spanish-American War and gained the nickname the Lion of the Rif for his part in the defeat of the Rif tribesmen of Morocco in 1925. Sanjurjo had been the general who told King Alfonso in 1930 that his support in the army was too weak to continue. By 1931, he was exercising his counter-guerrilla methods domestically as chief of the Civil Guard. All while the rising expectations generated by the new government led to increased social conflict in the countryside. That winter saw high unemployment for braceros in Andalusia and Extremadura, and in December, a demonstration of UGT-aligned farm workers in the village of Castilblanco erupted in violence that left 4 civil guardsmen dead. In January, the Civil Guard unleashed a wave of reprisal violence against striking peasants, culminating in a massacre of 15 civilians in Arendo in the north of Spain. Under massive public pressure, Azana removed Sanjurjo from command of the Civil Guard and moved him to command of the Carboneri, Spain's border and customs police force. Sanjurjo began plotting with aristocratic Carlist civilians to overthrow the Republican government. In August, in Seville, Sanjurjo made his Pronunciamento, insisting that he sought to end the godless government of Azana, not the Republic. But the times had passed by the line of the Rif, and the heavily politicized, easily mobilized working class of Spain sprung into action. Sanjurjo's allies in Madrid were dispersed in a farcical brawl. Apparently, Azana watched it happen from his balcony while smoking a cigarette. And in Seville itself, a joint CNT-UGT general strike broke the coup's momentum. Sanjurjo fled to be apprehended by Republican forces near the Portuguese border. And it was in the outraged aftermath of this botched coup that Azana's government was able to pass a statute for Catalan autonomy and agrarian reform. To punish the aristocracy, who were widely assumed to have been complicit in the coup, even if many of them had no idea what was happening, the punitive expropriation of noble lands was tacked onto the reform bill. However, by 1932, only 6% of the land in Spain was owned by the aristocracy, so formal expropriation was an insufficient basis for redistribution. Another provision of the law limited the amount of land a single owner could hold. All told, the reforms ended up freeing up enough land to settle about 60,000 farming families, which amounted to a spray of drops in the million-man ocean of landless Spanish braceros. Over 10 million hectares of land would have to change hands at gunpoint to accommodate the whole landless rural population. In addition to being insufficient, the reform was resisted at all points by the rural landowners. In the countryside, many of the political officials of the new regime were the same power-broking caciques of the days of the monarchy. One rural worker recalled a landowning family whose 3 sons were each members of a different Republican political party. Much of the land given to braceros was the least productive available. Compounding matters was the general poverty of the Spanish government. The new constitution included Spain's first income tax, but depression conditions killed demand for Spanish agricultural exports. Capital flight was another concern. A $60 million loan from J.P. Morgan that had been arranged in the last days of the monarchy was canceled as soon as the Republic was inaugurated. The richest Spaniards began sending their money out of the country. A promised agrarian bank that was supposed to provide cheap loans for the purchase of seed and modern farming machines was never established. The result was landless peasant families settled on marginal soil without access to the capital necessary to improve it. The countryside, where poverty and unemployment were double what they were in the cities, exploded with pain and rage. Rising expectations created by the first round of reform and frustration at the pace of progress was catalyzed by the increased mobilization capacity created by mass union membership. This generated a new militancy among the braceros of the South, a new sense of empowerment, and the awkward situation for the Republican coalition government, in which the ministers of labor and finance were members of the Socialist Party. These were men who were authorizing the violent breaking up of strikes and demonstrations by the very landless workers they claimed to represent. Now, this contradiction solidified the view among the anarchists that the state could never be an instrument of working class liberation. The anarchist peasants of the South responded to the advent of the Republic with periodic rebellions, which were called revolutionary gymnastics both by sympathizers and critics within the anarchist movement. The sympathizers with revolutionary gymnastics were embodied by the activities of the Anarchist Federation of Iberia, which in Spanish letters is the FAI. Very important. The FAI, folks. It's the ideological and militant vanguard of the anarchist movement. The FAI, which had been founded in the depths of the Rivera dictatorship's repression. It was a collection of affinity groups of often around a dozen activists, cells, if you will, dedicated to the idea that the anarchist revolution would come from the spontaneous action of the Spanish people, not from any political formation. The FAI existed to direct and inspire the actions of the people. The archetypal anarchist of this mold was the previously mentioned Buenaventura Durruti of the Nostromo group, which was the name of his cell, a career militant who had directed insurgent attacks against the Primo de Rivera regime and committed revolutionary bank expropriations in Latin America. Now, the critics of these cyclical explosions of popular resentment were known as the Trentistas, which were named after the 30 signatories of a 1931 statement which told the anarchists, look, guys, I know we all love doing illegal stuff, but the only real way we're going to change stuff is if we use political power and union organizing. That only through building structures of power can we pursue the seizure of power. Now, this pissed the shit out of the old school anarchists, and these Trentistas, the 30 signatories, and tens of thousands of their followers were formally expelled from the CNT. Get this shit out of here. We don't want any of your fucking political parties. We don't want any of your, even labor unions. We want spontaneous action of the workers to reform organically society and not be tainted by the authoritarian implications of the structures that you're talking about. We don't want to lose our love. We can't lose our love for each other by being subsumed to the dead hand of this discipline. Now, these people who were expelled ended up forming, some of them, a syndicalist party, an attempt to turn anarchism into a political movement, but it never really got anywhere in Catalonia. But these debates were ornamental to the unbreakable dynamic of a deeply poor, deeply resentful peasantry facing an economic depression and exploding political horizons. No matter what the eggheads in the anarchist movement thought about revolutionary gymnastics, they were an inevitable byproduct of the social conditions in the Spanish countryside in the South. They were not going to be able to make them happen or make them stop. For the first time, amongst this incredibly oppressed population, the world actually felt malleable and up for the taking. It felt like the growling of the stomachs that was more intolerable with each passing day could be silenced through action. CNT or FAI, the leaders of the anarchist movement, were forced to react in the aftermath of spontaneous peasant risings and strikes. Their lack of an ability to coordinate their grassroots with their leadership doomed every one of these explosions to a violent extinguishment because they could not be harnessed together to be wielded against the state.
Viva la FAI y la CNT, luchemos hermanos contra los tiranos y los requetés. Rojo pendón, negro color, luchemos hermanos aunque en la batalla debamos morir.
So this leads to the anarchists essentially forming something like a permanent insurgency within the Second Republic, a constant frothing illegal war while the formal mechanisms of politics continued on. This low-level war between CNT farmers and the civil guard in the countryside saw deaths on both sides, culminating in the Casa Viejas incident. Now, in the Andalusian village of Casa Viejas, a standoff between anarchists and civil guard ended with the civil guard massacring 24 CNT militants and their family members. Outrage from the rank and file of the socialist and anarchist movement boiled upwards at the government. Even the right wing cynically accused President Zamora and Prime Minister Azana of having blood on their hands. The scandal and general failure to advance beyond the gains of the first 2 years of the Republic bled support from the government and fueled internal strife throughout 1933, which was the worst year of the Depression in Spain. Now, in September, a dispute between the Socialist Party and one of the main Republican parties supporting the government brought down Azana's ministry, and new elections were called for. The liberals and socialists had claimed victory in 1931, in part due to the fracture of the Spanish right, existing as it did as a collection of regional parties organized around regional economic interests, and all of them hostile to the very idea of representative government. Now, 2 years of dramatic government reforms and rising labor militancy had the dual effect of driving the liberals and left apart while drawing the regional right together. In March of 1933, representatives of regional right parties, spearheaded by Popular Action, a Catholic populist group modeled after Action Française across the Pyrenees, there it goes again, every single time the French have an innovation, the Spanish copy it, met to form an electoral coalition. The result was the Spanish Coalition of Autonomous Rights, or CEDA, C-E-D-A, funded by the country's landowners and led by José María Gil Robles, a lawyer and son of a Carlist legal theorist. CEDA brought the often fractious local barons of Spain together around a national platform of belligerent Catholic nationalism, denouncing the first 2 years of the Republic as a descent into a godless Marxist maelstrom. For their part, the Socialist Party embraced radical militancy in its election platform, demanding the nationalization of the land, the dissolution of all religious orders, and the seizure of their property, as well as the dissolution of the army and the civil guard to be replaced by people's militias. The new Spanish Constitution rewarded coalitions, and the election in November saw a coherent right coalition in CEDA run against a Republican, liberal, and socialist left that were falling away from each other. This was also, by the way, the first Spanish election to allow votes for women. And the female population, which was generally more pious and church-going than the male, disproportionately supported the militantly Catholic CEDA. The results of the election were a massive win for CEDA, which was the single biggest vote-getter in the country. But the president of the Republic was still a good liberal, Niceto Zamora, and he refused to allow a government headed by Gil Robles to be formed. It's the old Popper's tolerant intolerance problem. Do you let into government people who would destroy your government? Gil Robles was a loud opponent of the secular reformism that was the sine qua non of representative government to guys like Zamora. CEDA was denied any ministerial posts in the new government, and the prime ministership passed to Alejandro Lerroux of the Radical Party. So at the turn of the century, 30 or so years ago, Lerroux led a group of young barbarians, he called them, which were working-class roustabouts who he put to war against the church and the monarchy. He was the essentially right populism of turn-of-the-century Barcelona. He captured all of the non-anarchist workers in a general anti-clerical thuggery. That's why he called them young barbarians. But it was proto-fascist opportunism. And by the 30s, Leroux's party was an ideologically vacant collection of machine hacks, because it had always just been a way to gain power. Hey, what do these guys hate? The church? I'll help them hate the church and the king. And I'll give them power, and I'll let them smash some windows. And then they won't start thinking about overthrowing the government, and they'll maybe give me some political power within it. And it was funded by the corrupt Primo-era monopolists like the tobacco millionaire Juan March. Conflict between the socialists and radicals had brought down Azana's government, and now Lerroux and his followers were happy to front for a right-wing government of monarchical Catholic nationalists in exchange for access to political spoils and patronage. Leroux's government was made all the more galling by the facts that the vagaries of the Constitution meant that 800,000 radical votes had translated to 104 seats in the Cortes, while 1.6 million socialist votes had netted only 61 seats. I love to net 61 seats. This radical fig leaf did little to quiet the unease on the left at the rise of CETA. The situation in the rest of Europe only deepened the anxiety. In March of 1933, Hitler's government in Germany passed the Enabling Acts and began the process of destroying leftist opposition to the Nazi regime. In the same month in Austria, the diminutive Austro-fascist Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who advocated a Catholic corporatist government very similar to CETA's program, exploited a parliamentary crisis to abolish Austrian democracy. Now, as 1934 dawned, the Catholic corporatists of CETA were poised to reverse the reforms of the first 2 years of Republican rule and perhaps abolish the Republic itself. Now, returning into power, the landowners who financially backed CETA acted as the restored French Bourbons had, by forgetting nothing and learning nothing. General San Giorgio, whose death sentence had been commuted to a 30-year prison term as an olive branch to the right, was pardoned and allowed to enter exile in the neighboring right-wing dictatorship of Portugal. Agrarian reform was halted and the municipal law reversed. Employers began assembling blacklists of known socialist workers to ban from future employment. Rural wages plummeted. This was the start of what would be later known by the left as the 2 black years of reactionary rule, made even worse by collapsing economic conditions caused by the continuing global depression. Britain and France enacted protectionist policies that destroyed Spain's agricultural export market. Foreign trade fell 70% from 1931 to 1935. The Latin American countries where Spaniards had emigrated for generations closed their borders and repatriated Spanish immigrants. Factory closures in the cities, some of which were politically motivated, sent urban migrants back to their home villages. So at the very moment that subsistence was hardest to come by in the countryside, the pressure valve of emigration reversed. There were more mouths to feed and fewer jobs in the countryside than ever. The Socialist Party newspaper claimed, "Never, not even in the worst days of the monarchy, did the peasants feel more enslaved and wretched than now."
Y como ser humano, el hombre lo que quiere es su pan. Las habladurías le bastan ya, porque estas nada le dan.
Socialist Party journalists could write about the enslaved wretchedness of the braceros of southern Spain, but it was another thing altogether to experience it in your day-to-day life. The cumulative agony of the landless peasants drove the Socialist Party into chronic internal conflict and hindered coordinated political action. Over the summer of 1934, Largo Caballero, the ascetic former plasterer and leader of the more radical faction of the socialists, moved to build a workers' alliance of proletarian parties and unions, from the communists to the CNT. The liberal Republicans would never take extra-parliamentary action against the government, but the Marxists and anarchists could. But while the unions and parties that represented the interests of the urban and rural workers met to negotiate terms of cooperation and reacted to political developments in the Cortes, the actual suffering braceros, languishing on 2.5 pesetas a day, took action on their own terms. It was always difficult to keep hungry laborers and well-fed union officials on the same page, but the deep economic and social crisis of 1934 broke the connection between the rural rank and file and union leaders. The social and political isolation of the braceros in the villages was total. In the cities, many small bourgeois and professionals had liberal politics and believed themselves to be on the side of the workers in some sense. But in the countryside, social life was deeply bifurcated. Professionals, like big landowners, wore ties and shoes, not straw hats and sandals. They, like the big landowners, lived in houses, not flea-ridden barracks. The only way for the suffering braceros to breach the social divide was through militant labor action. The only way to get the attention of the other side was through violence. And in the summer of 1934, strikes and demonstrations popped off across southern Spain as particular local conditions sparked particular local responses. General strikes flared in Valencia and Zaragoza. The working class unions and political parties were unable to coordinate responses to these actions, and one by one they were crushed by the landowners and the civil guard. By the fall of 1934, militancy among the 500,000 rural UGT members had been momentarily broken, at the precise moment that CETA provoked a political crisis that would finally push Caballero's Workers' Alliance into action. Gil Robles saw a violent conflict with the left as inevitable. Sooner or later, he said, we would have to face a revolutionary coup. it would always be preferable to face it from a position of power before the enemy was better prepared. And to this end, Gil Robles engineered a series of provocations. He had taken his honeymoon in Nuremberg to witness Nazi rallies, and he brought that staging and drama to Spain. Supporters would march past him giving stiff-armed salutes and calling out Jefe. At a rally for the Seda Youth Division, featuring thousands of peasants paid to attend and bussed in by political bosses, Gil Robles declared, "We are an army of citizens ready to give our lives for God and for Spain. No one can stop us from imposing our ideas on the government of Spain." It was widely understood that the left's red line would be the inclusion of Seda members in the governing cabinet. And on October 4th, 1934, Gil Robles used his influence as leader of the largest party in the Cortes to insist on 3 Seda ministerial positions, one of them a prosecutor who had ordered the confiscation of thousands of copies of the socialist newspaper. So, at the moment when grassroots worker energy in the countryside was most broken and dispirited, the Workers' Alliance launched a tepid general strike in Madrid with the goal of forcing President Zamora to call new elections. At the same time, a separate political crisis flared in Catalonia, where the Generalitat, still controlled by Companys and the left Esquerra, had their own agrarian reform laws stricken down by the central judicial authority. A radical faction of Catalan nationalists, who were the closest thing the Catalan bourgeois ever came to fascism, forced Companys' hand, and a Catalan republic was declared. Now, both of these movements in Madrid and Barcelona lacked support from the toiling masses. The rural section of the UGT had exhausted itself over the summer and provided little support for the general strike. The CNT in Barcelona had no more respect for a Catalan state than a Castilian one and stood aloof from the independence push. In Madrid and Barcelona, government forces were able to suppress the insurgencies with relative ease. But there was one place where the local conditions and organizations came together to create a serious, sustained challenge to the central government. Asturias, on the north-central Atlantic coast, was the center of Spanish mining. The miners of Asturias were among the best-paid laborers in the country and the most well-organized, with both UGT and CNT represented in the workforce. Years of struggle against the mine owners on questions of employment and workplace safety had given the socialist and anarchist unions, constantly in conflict with each other in the rest of Spain, ample opportunity to cooperate. The lack of large landowners in Asturias meant that there was no restive class of hyper-exploited migrant braceros in the countryside accelerating conflict. Anarchist and socialist miners in Asturias made the Workers' Alliance a reality, where everywhere else it had been a fantasy. Only there did the entry of Seda into the government have the effect of galvanizing the entire working class into action, because it wasn't responding to specific conflicts, because there was a general well-being. There was no hyper-exploited class here. Everybody has a paycheck or they're unemployed within that class. So they can wait for a political spark to mobilize around and act around instead of being forced to always respond after a conflict has already been initiated. The Workers' Alliance in Asturias were certain of one thing. Spain would not be allowed to go the way of Italy, Germany, and Austria. The working class of Spain would not go without a fight. As the UGT and CNT moved towards a rising, they met resistance from an unlikely source, a small but well-organized group of Asturian communists. Through the summer of 1934, the Asturian communists refused to join any plans to rise against the government. But when it became clear that the UGT and CNT miners were dead set on acting if Seda took power, they went along. This sort of tracks with the way Marx treated the Paris Commune. You don't want them to do it, but once they go for it, you have to go along, or else you have betrayed the will of the workers. On the 4th of October, the miners set down their tools and picked up their rifles, many of which had been smuggled into Asturias over the course of the summer by Indelico Prieto, the leader of the moderate wing of the Socialist Party. Prieto will always zig when you think he's going to zag. Uttering the slogan, "Hup!" which stood for UHP, or Unite Proletarian Brothers, they seized public buildings in the Asturian capital of Oviedo, imprisoned leading rightists, and declared a workers' government. The mines and arms factories were taken over. Money was abolished and replaced with ration coupons. Dynamite used in mining was turned into weapons of war. The previously reluctant communists put yeoman's work into the cause. Soon, the entire region was in the hand of the workers, and the local army and civil guard were powerless to stop them. The Spanish Civil War is often referred to as the dress rehearsal for World War II. If that's the case, then the October 34 Asturian uprising is the dress rehearsal for the dress rehearsal. A dynamic was established there that would be repeated 2 years later. Spanish colonial mercenaries brought to the mainland to break the power of the working class. Now, knowing that the underpaid, under-equipped, low-morale Peninsular Army stood little chance against the highly motivated and well-armed Asturian miners, the central government authorized the deployment, for the first time, of colonial Moroccan forces in Spain. While the Peninsular Army was a collection of time-serving bureaucrats relaxing on top of a groaning mass of insolent peasant conscripts, the army in colonial Morocco was a different beast altogether. In 1920, the Spanish had created their own foreign legion on the French model to better dominate their Moroccan possessions. Once again, they're out constantly copying off the frog's paper. But while the French Foreign Legion offered French citizenship to tramps and criminals from around the world in exchange for service, the Spanish Foreign Legion was mostly made up of Spanish citizens who were looking for a steady paycheck or an alternative to prison. Their slogan was "Viva la Muerte," long live death. And for 16 years, they had been the tip of the spear of the Spanish colonial project in Morocco. The other military units in Spanish Morocco were made up of mercenary Rif natives who, having been defeated by the combined efforts of Spain and France, said, "If you can't beat them, join them," and signed up to fight for their colonial masters. These troops were known as regulares, in contrast to the Moroccan irregulars, who continued to resist European colonial authority. Faced with the resolute defiance of the Asturian miners, the central government deployed foreign legionnaires and Moroccan regular mercenaries under Generals Francisco Franco, late of the Zaragoza Military Academy, and Manuel Godet, to Asturias to crush the rebellion. Over the next 2 weeks, Franco and Godet's legionnaires and regulares, augmented by bombs dropped by the nascent Spanish Air Force, slowly ground down the Asturian rebellion. For 14 days, the African forces slugged it out with the CNT-UGT miners. Eventually, the miners surrendered on the condition that the Moroccans not be the first soldiers into the town. This conflict, workers' militias against air and ground power with the colonial occupying army, would be repeated 2 years later. Deaths on both sides came to around 2,000, and incidents of summary execution, rape, and torture defined the government conquest. Right-wing press reports decried the executions of priests and right-wingers during the occupation and demanded severe punishment for the rebellion's leaders. While the liberals and national left parties had stood by during the destruction of radical Asturias, they rallied to the cause of amnesty and exoneration for the imprisoned leadership of the rebellion. Typical. The liberal and socialist leadership were like, look, we do not want you to rebel against the government, but once it's over, they will say that they should be freed and exonerated, because that is a demand that the system can hold. It's always easier for liberals to embrace revolution after it's been safely neutralized. The Asturias Rising became the psychic fulcrum of politics for the remainder of the Second Republic. No one on either side of Spanish politics believed afterward that democratic governments could persist in the long term. Either the left would seize power and expropriate the landowners, or the right would drive the liberals out of the halls of power and break the working class once and for all. In the immediate aftermath, between 20,000 to 30,000 leftists were arrested around the country, including Manuel Azana, Largo Caballero, and Luis Campañas. Preto, that wily little boy, had fled to France before the Asturias Uprising. Largo took his time in prison to finally read for the first time in his life the works of Lenin and Marx. The socialist Casas de Pueblos were closed, and the government debated whether to ban the Socialist Party and UGT entirely. But even with this crackdown, the government failed to do what Hitler or Dollfuss had done and used the crisis to abolish democracy. While Gil Robles and the Seda flirted with fascist iconography and ritual, their political project was fundamentally conservative. They were happy to use the powers of government to suppress their enemies without risking a fatal institutional rupture. Spain did have a fascist party, the Falange, which had been formed out of a merger of two smaller fascist groups in 1933 and was led by the dapper son of the former dictator, José Antonio Primo de Rivera. Primo held the Falange's only seat in the Cortes, and the membership in 1935 sat in the low thousands. The Falange held some appeal to bourgeois students and resentful service workers in Madrid, but it had no mass base. Because Spain had been neutral in World War I, it lacked the huge numbers of brutally traumatized combat veterans who filled the ranks of fascist movements elsewhere in Europe. Even the Spanish variant of fascism was less radical than elsewhere. For one thing, it was much more oriented towards the Catholic Church. Otherwise, Falange policy was the same half-witted dog's breakfast of reactionary anti-capitalism and social hysteria typical of Carlism, only with a blue shirt instead of a red beret. But Gil Robles spent 1935 using the institutions of the Republic to advance a broadly reactionary agenda that the left saw, in the zero-sum context of the continued depression, as an existential threat. Just as the liberal left government had finally brought the regional right-wing movements into national coalition, the actions of the radical/SEDA government had the same effect for the liberals and left who had drifted apart while in power. In March 1935, Manuel Azaña, having been released from prison without charges, headlined a rally in Madrid. Before 300,000 people, he made an eloquent argument for liberal left political unity. Azaña was aided in his quest by a dramatic change in Communist Party policy. Spain's Communist Party had been formed in the 1920s by dissident leftists who viewed the Soviet Union as the headquarters of global Marxist revolution. The early communists were the most motivated and the youngest members of the socialist movements, the ones who were most emotionally offended by capitalism, the ones who were most insistent on having a cause to follow, who most emanated the emotional energy that would once have gone into religious orders. It was those people who saw the Bolshevik Revolution as the millennium and sought to bring it about in Spain. It attracted young, highly motivated activists who fully embraced the discipline and purpose that came with submission to a higher authority. For them, the socialists and anarchists who quailed at the Soviet Union's harsh but necessary methods of rule had no real interest in defeating their class enemies. The rural pueblo had been surpassed by the rush of history, and only by moving through the contradictions of modernization, not by avoiding them, and guided by the only workers' party anywhere in the world to achieve state power, the Soviet Union, could victory be achieved. The Communist Party of Spain, like the Falange, was electorally marginal, but boasted an outsized organizational capacity, and had new marching orders from the Comintern in Moscow. Until 1933, the Comintern, the Communist International that coordinated communist actions from Moscow, had insisted that no communist party cooperate in any way with liberal or non-communist socialist parties or unions. According to the official third period ideology of the time, capitalism was in its death throes, and social fascist left parties only existed to keep it alive unnaturally. After a fatal split between the German Social Democrats and the German Communists that allowed Hitler to come to power in Germany, Soviet policy changed dramatically. To prevent fascism from achieving power elsewhere, communists were now told to drop their hostility to non-communist parties and to form broad popular front coalitions wherever possible against a mutually conceived fascist threat. So in 1935, Spanish communists extended feelers to the liberal and Marxist parties about creating just such an alliance. In May, Gil Robles claimed the war ministry and promoted reliably right-wing officers such as General Franco, who was made chief of staff, while purging known Republican sympathizers from the army. It was only a matter of time before SEDA claimed the prime ministership. This was unacceptable to President Zamora, and LaRue's Radical Party was undone by a very fitting gambling scandal. It's very complicated and dumb, but LaRue is apparently bribed by a Dutch con artist, a Lyle Landley-style guy, to legalize a specific type of roulette wheel for legal gambling in Spain. And in so doing, he brought down the Radical Party, and made it so that the SEDA would have to lead the government for it to continue. So Zamora was caught between the procedures of the Constitution and his own liberal interests. Gil Robles insisted on the right to form a new government, but a Prime Minister Gil Robles might end democracy, as Mussolini, Dollfuss, and Hitler had. Rather than allow that to happen, Zamora used his presidential prerogative to dissolve the Cortes on January 4th, 1936, and call new elections to be held on February 16th. The next month saw a frenzied, hysteric round of campaigning, with a popular front of the liberal Republicans and Marxists arrayed against a national front of right-wing parties. Both sides used radio broadcasts, mass rallies, and billboards to paint a terrifying picture of what victory by their opponents would bring. A right-wing paper wrote, "The fortune of Spain, 300,000 million pesetas, will be nationalized and taken over or destroyed by Soviet communism. Those who haven't lost their lives will be out of work, in the street with only the clothes on their back. Workers, employees, civil servants, if you vote for the communist, socialist, leftist, revolutionary bloc, you will be slaves, working only for bad food and poor clothing." Folks, poor clothing. And eating only at bad food restaurants? The bad food government. No, thank you. A Popular Front placard rejoined, "The SEDA and its accomplices are asking you for your votes in order to continue their work of terror, injustice, and theft of the past 2 years. The Popular Front asks for your help and your votes to free 30,000 men from jail, to make sure 70,000 return to their workplaces, and to demand retribution of the torturers and thieves." Much of the race ended up being a litigation on the October 34 Asturias revolt. The Popular Front promised amnesty for the imprisoned and vowed to end workplace discrimination against leftists. As usual, the anarchists rejected the choice and condemned the state in toto. Solidaridad Obrera, the official CNT newspaper, wrote, "The problem of Spain is not one of political change, but of transforming the economy. In the elections, the proletariat is aligned with the bourgeois parties, forgetting its essential mission of preparing and organizing itself to transform society." Nevertheless, many anarchists ended up voting for the Popular Front in the hopes that they would at least free their revolutionary brothers and sisters from prison. And crucially, both sides implied heavily that they would not accept the election of the other peacefully. For all the blood and thunder of the campaign, the election itself was relatively peaceful and free of controversy, though of course there was some. The results reflected the reality of a deeply divided country. 4.6 million votes cast for the Popular Front, 4.5 million votes for the National Front, with 500,000 for the rapidly disappearing center, which included the Basque nationalist parties. The vagaries of apportionment resulted in a huge Popular Front majority in the Cortes. For the left, it felt like a vindication. For the right, it felt like the end of the world. The short and turbulent life of the Popular Front government was packed with frenzied incident, all of which occurred in an atmosphere of economic freefall. Spain's wealthiest citizens immediately punished the country for the crime of voting for the left, with factory closures and a capital strike that saw the value of the peseta plummet in world markets. An increasingly radical Largo Caballero refused to allow the Socialist Party to claim any ministries in the new government. From his position outside of it, Largo spoke repeatedly about the futility of legal politics and the inevitability of social revolution, to the deep frustration of the nerd Preto. Both supporters and detractors saw Largo as the Spanish Lenin, waiting in the wings to overthrow the shaky Popular Front. But this rhetorical posture was aimed at keeping the radical braceros of the rural UGT from defecting to the anarchists, and Largo showed little of the brutal initiative of the Bolsheviks in 1917. In this respect, he mirrored his enemy Gil Robles, whose ambivalence to the idea of a right-wing seizure of power saw him eclipsed in the Cortes by the monarchist firebrand Kelvo Sotelo, who spent his brief time in the Cortes trolling the fuck out of the left every day, saying, "Wouldn't it be funny if we did a coup? Haha, but no, seriously. What if we couped? No, seriously. Well, I wouldn't do that, of course not. But seriously, what if we did? What if we couped? No, seriously. I'm kidding. But maybe? What do you think? I don't know. Could we coup? We'll see. Pooh. The systematic violence of Spanish social life exploded into public clashes between gunslinging young Phalangists and socialists in Madrid. This violence wasn't stopped by the outlawing of the Falange in March or the imprisonment of its leader, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, on gun charges. In Extremadura, tens of thousands of landless peasants took agrarian reform into their own hands, occupying latifundist land and attempting to farm it without access to capital for tools or seeds. Those imprisoned after Asturias were released, and blacklisted employees were ordered to be rehired. In Barcelona, the Generalitat was restored and Companys was released from prison. In May, Prieto orchestrated the cynical impeachment of President Zamora for his decision to dissolve the previous government, and he was replaced by the only politician acceptable to all Popular Front parties, the August Republican statesman Manuel Azana. The way they impeached Zamora was so cold-blooded. He had stopped Gil Robles from being prime minister by dissolving the government. And then because Prieto wanted somebody he could trust more and was more connected to the left wing, they impeached him for dissolving the parliament. Just cold-blooded. But politics ain't beanbag, folks. Bye-bye, Zamora! The liberal Galician lawyer Cesar Quiroga became prime minister. By the way, I got to put this in there just because it's bugging me. He's not technically prime minister, okay? The position is called the President of the Council of Ministers. It's very annoying that it's not prime minister, but that's why I just say prime minister, because it's faster. But anyway, I can't stop thinking about it. Sorry for that. In June, UGT and CNT construction workers went on strike in Madrid. Later that month, the socialist and communist youth movements merged under socialist leadership, but with communist direction. The energy of the youth powered much of the political instability of the time. It must be emphasized. So Spain at this point is a sclerotic society riven with internal tensions that is being drowned in testosterone. You had that baby boom of the World War I era that is now coming into young manhood. And it is young men in the socialist movement, in the anarchist movement, and the young señoritos, the students of the middle class who end up fighting it out in the streets, shooting one another as a way to express a otherwise inexpressible political will to power. On July 2nd, in Madrid, 2 Falangists were killed in a cafe drive-by, leading to the reprisal murder of 2 workers leaving a Casa del Pueblo. On July 12th, Juan Castillo, an assault guard lieutenant and Socialist Party member who had provided military training to a socialist militia, was assassinated by Phalangists. The next day, some of his assault guard comrades sought revenge. After searching for several potential targets, including Gil Robles, they eventually drove to the home of Calvo Sotelo and knocked on the door in the dead of night. They roused Calvo from bed and took him to their car, where he was promptly shot. The next day, Castillo and Sotelo were both buried, the day culminating in a shootout between Phalangist and assault guards that left 4 dead. Among the middle class, the constant refrain was that this couldn't go on any longer, that something had to be done. It was, of course, rich, coming from people who were largely responsible for exacerbating the conditions through capital strike. The bourgeois at this time are closing factories, pushing their money out of the country, accelerating conflict, and then they say the resulting political violence must not go on. Something has to happen. For braceros and workers struggling to survive and frustrated by the pace of reform, the sentiment was similar. This could not be allowed to continue. President Azana appeared to all as the Spanish Kerensky, but with Largo incapable of fulfilling his role as Spanish Lenin, the future appeared to be a continued, agonized stalemate. Brittle Republican institutions could not contain the roiling class conflict, but no political faction had the organizational capacity to press their advantage. Since the early 19th century, this sort of deliberative exhaustion was always resolved by the one institution of Spanish life capable of forceful independent action: the army. The victory of the Popular Front had caught the right by surprise. Franco himself had wept and begged Gil Robles to declare martial law, but the parliamentary leader did not want to make the first move in abolishing democracy. Whether they're from the left or the right, bourgeois politicians are all allergic to responsibility. Carlist aristocrats began smuggling weapons and creating training camps for their peasant requetes, but they lacked the numbers to initiate a successful coup. A requete is the name for a Carlist soldier, the yeoman farmer. It's like a Minuteman. It's the Spanish Minuteman, ready to go from his hoe to his to take the rifle off of his mantelpiece and be ready in 5 minutes. That is the requete. But they lacked the numbers to initiate a successful coup. They only really had the popular base really up there in Navarre. The new Popular Front government was well aware that the upper ranks of the military were fundamentally hostile to them, and one of their first acts was to disperse the more reactionary generals away from positions of authority in the capital. Before they all went their separate ways, a number of these generals met on March 5th in Madrid to discuss a plan of action. At the meeting were Generals Franco and Godet, the conquerors of Asturias, as well as other future leaders of the military rising, names like Fanjul, Quindelan, and Mola. Of them all, Franco was the most hesitant to sign off on a rebellion. One thing these generals all had in common was that they had risen up the ranks fighting in Morocco, not moldering on the peninsula. It's not accurate to really say that the army rose against the Republic in 1936. The Peninsular Officer Corps were mostly contented bureaucrats with no desire to rock the boat either way, and the common soldiers were largely sullen peasant and working-class conscripts. The rising was made by those who had fought and killed for Spain in the last remnant of its once globe-spanning empire, where nationalist bluster was consecrated in blood and turned real. The soldiers they would depend on to spearhead the rising were the well-blooded Spanish and Moroccan mercenaries occupying the Rif. On the peninsula, the moving force of rebellion were the junior officers, those precariously balanced between hostile subordinates and impassive superiors. For them, a military government promised something that had been hard to come by in an army where officers guarded their positions: promotion. So you have a situation where you have people who have one way or another been brutalized into weapons of violence, like the officers and men in the Moroccan army, and then those in the Peninsular Army who were molded into weapons of ambition by their middle-class position between the rank and file and their superiors, who sat there like fat ticks on those sinecures and never, ever retired. These junior officers were organized in a clandestine group, the Spanish Military Union, UME. In 1936, there were 3,400 active duty Army officers in the UME and another 1,800 reserved and retired auxiliaries. They are the ones who did the work of building a coup infrastructure within Spain. The Popular Front move to scatter the reactionary generals backfired dramatically. Franco was sent to the Canary Islands, which is just a short hop from Spanish Morocco. Godet was sent to the Balearic Islands, a short hop from Barcelona. Emiliano Mola, an owlish, bespectacled administrative whiz, was sent to Pamplona, the capital of Navarre, heartland of Carlism. Once there, Mola immediately began. It's almost like they did it on purpose. I don't think they did, but it might as well have been. Every one of them went a place where they would be needed to supervise the creation of an infrastructure for a coup. Once there, Mola immediately began discussions with the leading Carlist aristocrats about a military-civilian alternative government. He understood that the era of the simple pronunciamento was over. Civilian support would be crucial to standing up a new state. The Carlists set up a headquarters across the border in France to facilitate liaisons with members of the UME. After a botched amateurish coup was easily foiled in April, General Mola took control of all military planning under the codename The Director. Couriers, often high society ladies and dashing young junior officers, traveled across the country to bring key army personnel into the conspiracy. It was agreed that the exiled General San Giorgio would be the figurehead of the new government, and Mola had to conduct excruciating negotiations with the Carlists over the look and feel of the new state. After the Civil War, there would be claims that the Sotelo assassination had been the last straw, which forced the army to act. But the only reason the rising hadn't already happened at that point was because of an argument between Mola and the Carlists about the flag that they would be flying during the rebellion. Now, Mola, as a modern pragmatic officer, understood that the monarchy had lost legitimacy among the people of Spain and wanted to rise on behalf of the Republic, which was a vital and legitimate political institution, and to argue that the communists and anarchists were destroying it. And as such, he wanted to fight under the Republican bicolor. But the Carlists demanded that the army rise under the old monarchist tricolor, because the Carlist leaders were a bunch of goofball aristocrats, a bunch of LARPing military popinjays, whereas the military rising was led by hard-headed realists and professionals. Folks, we love hierarchy and all, but we also know it's the 20th century. The king is embarrassing. It's a cringe idea. This argument grew so tedious and protracted that Mola, who was a kind of a excitable sort, considered suicide, but eventually a compromise was reached, basically because the eagerness of the Carlist rank and file to get on with it overrode the political scruples of the leadership. The Minutemen in the countryside are polishing their fucking machetes. They're ready to go. They don't give a fuck what a flag looks like. And it's them that kind of push the Carlists into making an agreement that ends up fucking them over. From his prison cell, Jose Antonio, the leader of the Falange, committed his forces to the rising as well. Even Franco eventually got off the fence and signed on. The date would be July 18th. The army would take Spanish Morocco, and the next day, UME officers would lead troops out of their barracks to take the cities of the peninsula. Mola would consolidate power in the north, Gueded would take Catalonia, and Franco would advance to the south from Morocco, all to converge triumphantly on Madrid. It's correct to call the coup plotting a conspiracy, but it was not really in any way secret. There were a small number of left-wing junior officers in the army. They had their own organization, the UMRA, and they were aware at all points what their colleagues were doing. Nobody was hiding it. They were being told at mess hall, like, get ready, Red, we're going to kill you. But every attempt to alert the liberals in charge of the Popular Front government was ignored. Even civilians, like the communist representative Dolores Iburi, known as La Pasionera for her fiery speeches, warned the government about what was coming. They knew. Now the government, President Azana and Prime Minister Quiroga, were adamant that the military posed no threat. They likely thought any coup that would happen would be another pratfall, an opportunity to root out disloyal officers and bolster the government's legitimacy. They also knew that acting first to dismantle the plot would mean ordering the military to essentially turn on itself, a proposition that no one in the Popular Front government trusted. For Azana, it came down to this: if I order this coup to be stopped, I might very well start it, because the army will refuse and turn on me. But again, the allergy to responsibility of the bourgeois politician means that they had to live in cloud cuckoo land and wait passively for something to happen. It was either do that or do something that Prieto had demanded from the prime minister on the night of Sotelo's assassination: arm the workers. Head off the rising by giving guns to the working class. Quiroga refused. Without confidence in itself and fearful of the working class, the government instead chose denial. In July, some frustrated UMRA left-wing officers hatched a plot to kidnap or kill the leading conspirators, to do something. But Quiroga found out about it and thwarted it. Regardless of the mounting violence in the streets, the escalating apocalyptic rhetoric, and the general breakdown of social life, the liberal leaders of the Republic refused to believe a breach was in the offing. Meanwhile, officers across Spain and Morocco awaited telegrams bearing the code word Covadonga, to signal that the time had come. Covadonga is a small town in Asturias, and the site of the first Christian victory over Muslim forces in Spain in 722 AD, a victory that had begun the centuries-long process of reconquest. This was how the generals and Carlists and Phalangists and sympathetic bourgeois who would end up composing the nationalist side of the Civil War saw their task: the reconquest of Spain from the forces of godless Judeo-Bolshevism and the reestablishment of eternal Spanish values. They would make a modern Spain on the backs of the workers, unhindered by carping liberals. The rising began in betrayal. On the morning of July 17th, in Miella, the capital of Spanish Morocco, one of the conspirators informed loyal authorities of the plot, which was scheduled to begin the next day. When officers attempted to arrest the plotters, a standoff ensued that saw the loyal officers surrender to the superior elan of the plotters. The rebellious soldiers moved quickly to seize control of the city, arrest the commanding general and mayor, and declare martial law. There were a small number of left-wing workers in the city who rallied at the Casa de Pueblo. They were promptly massacred. Spain may have avoided the mass trauma of World War I, but the Africanistas who had made the rebellion had seen their share of carnage in the Rif War and were not squeamish about dishing it out to their enemies, Republican officials and militant workers.
Frente al cabo de palo sobre las aguas, retumban los cañones sobre las llamas. ¿Qué será? Ay, ¿qué pasará? ¿Qué estará pasando? La marina española que está luchando. ¿Para qué tantos humos, tantos faroles?
In Las Palmas, in the Canary Islands, Franco pushed the timetable ahead a day and quickly took control there, sending a telegram message to forces across Spain. Glory to the heroic army of Africa, Spain above everything. Accept the enthusiastic greeting of those garrisons which join you and all the other comrades in the peninsula in this historic moment. Blind faith in victory. Long live Spain with honor. Franco's Hamlet Act hadn't prevented him from arranging a private air charter, courtesy of the tobacco millionaire Juan March and an English Catholic publisher, which had secretly made its way from England to the Canaries over the previous week. Now, Franco took the de Havilland Dragon Rapide from Las Palmas to Spanish Morocco, where resistance to the rising was wiped out within a day. Executions soon followed, including that of Franco's first cousin, authorized by Franco's own hand. By the evening of the 17th, the government in Madrid was fully aware of what was happening across the Strait of Gibraltar, but PM Quiroga rejected a request from the unions to distribute arms to the workers, insisting that at every turn that trust in the military powers of the state. The next day at noon, General Gonzalo Quepodiano, commander of the Carboneri border police, took control of the local garrison in Seville, again just by walking in and acting like he was in charge. That is how Quepodiano took Seville. Because he was a Carboneri, he was not in the military hierarchy. He just marched. He had lunch, and then he walked into the barracks and said, "March out under my orders," and everyone just did, because he wanted to do something as opposed to just sit around all day and brush flies away from his face. What happened next established the pattern of the rising across the country. The decisiveness of government and the union leadership determined the fate of the city. In Seville, existing tension between the UGT and the CNT led to paralysis. In places like Madrid and Seville, there had actually been more violence between the socialists and the anarchists than between the anarchists and the Falange at any point. A joint general strike was announced over the union-operated radio stations, but the workers remained hunkered down in their neighborhoods, while Quepodiano consolidated his control over the center of the city and began broadcasting the first of what would become nightly drunken, taunting radio broadcasts. This was the first modern conflict to be transmitted over the radio waves and the first modern conflict to be podcasted, because Quepodiano is a podcaster at heart. He spends the war giving hour-long harangues about how the Republic was going to be destroyed, how all the Reds were going to get killed, how all their girlfriends were going to fall in love with the nationalists. Just trash talk nonstop. Incredibly vulgar stuff, really. A dirtbag rightist for certain. And on his first broadcast, Quepo vowed he would reestablish order that had been subverted by foreign powers, and he condemned the Marxist conglomerate that had deformed the character of Spain. That night, the CNT in Barcelona sprang into action in the face of the Generalitat's paralysis, grabbing weapons wherever they could and bracing for the morning. Barcelona was deemed critical to the success of the rising, and with 12,000 troops in Catalonia and General Gudet set to fly in from the Balearics, all of which quickly fell to the rebels, success seemed assured. At 5 a.m. on the morning of the 19th, troops from the Pedralbes barracks were told by their officers that they were being deployed to put down another one of those pesky cyclical anarchist uprisings. They were marched out to claim key buildings in the city center. This was a story that would have been very believable to any regular Joe in the Spanish army. The anarchists are at it again. They're out there hooting and hollering in the streets. We got to go tell them to stop. But General Gudet didn't arrive to coordinate the rising until later in the day, and the initial push into the city was haphazard, with units scattered, uncoordinated, and immediately beset by militants. Soon, the rebel soldiers were either barricaded in their barracks or under siege in those crucial buildings, like the major hotels and the telephone exchange they had been occupied. By the time Goded's plane arrived from Majorca, the rising's momentum had been blunted. Meanwhile, CNT workers drove trucks loaded with loudspeakers around the city to relay news and raise morale. At this crucial moment, the Civil Guard commander marched his forces into the middle of the city, and to the surprise and elation of the crowd, they declared their allegiance to the Republic. Now, this is likely more due to the desire to back what looked like a winning horse than because of any ideological commitment, but the actions of the Guard were still crucial to rolling up the rebellion in Barcelona. In Montjuïc Castle, towering over the city, soldiers shot their nationalist officers and handed guns over to the CNT. Assault guards and workers convinced an army artillery crew to turn their guns on rebel strongholds. Across the city, troops, who were largely peasant conscripts after all, began to switch sides. Captured artillery forced the surrender of General Goded, who agreed to announce his capitulation in a nationwide radio broadcast, which was a huge morale blow wherever it was heard by the right. He would be shot for treason in August. Across the city, churches burned, and priests, who were thought to be aiding the rebels, were killed. By the night of the 19th, the central city had been cleared of rebels. Most of the buildings had been taken by some combination of civil and assault guard, but the telephone exchange had been captured by CNT militants. The only remaining holdout were the troops and officers of the Atarazanas barracks near the port of Barcelona. On the morning of the 20th, the CNT insisted on claiming the prize for themselves and putting their stamp on the successful suppression of the uprising. Waves of anarchists charged at the barracks, suffering heavy casualties. Francisco Escaso, one of the most influential CNT radicals and a close collaborator of Durruti, was one of the first to fall. Even after air power and artillery, which could have pounded the barracks into submission, were brought in, the anarchists continued to swarm the barracks until it finally surrendered. Over 500 anarchists died in the assault. And that is really the mark of anarchist military power. They are highly motivated, but they don't take orders, and they are hard to coordinate. Herding pissed off armed cats. A huge energy XP at a huge cost of efficiency. But the catch-22 is that what motivated them was their sense of freedom, that they were doing it of their own will, and that they were being uncoerced. But coercion is the key to the military efficiency that allows you to effectively deploy forces. It is a Gordian knot that they never figure out how to unwrap. These deaths didn't dampen the atmosphere of giddy festivity that seized Barcelona that evening. Armored cars paraded through the cities, tapping out a honk meant to represent the letters CNT-FAI. Every street corner thronged with celebrants drunk on victory and vino. For the anarchists of the city, some 60% of the working class population, their triumph was the ultimate triumph of the idea. The people of the city had come together to beat back the forces of fascism, even converting the civil guard and large numbers of simple soldiers to their cause through their passion and direct human communication. The millennium had arrived. A new world was possible, and it was being built with every breath through the spontaneous actions of the workers of the city. The CNT was armed. The Generalitat was at their mercy. The future was unwritten. But the fate of the revolution in Barcelona would depend on how the rising fared across the rest of Spain.
Arriba los pobres del mundo, arriba.